I think people who are interested in ideas tend to think ideas are important. My sort of study into wokeness shows that it's actually often not ideas. It's just sort of bureaucratic initiatives or responding to a certain election or trying to get voters in some way. It leads to this law that leads to this like industry popping up, and then this industry sort of justifies what they wanted to do in the first place. It's not like there's a type of like there's a conservative gene or a conservative trait or a liberal trait, right? So it seems like a certain combination of a kind of man becomes a conservative. He might be smart, but not too smart. And he might be very masculine, right? Or very sort of tribal in his instinct. And I think that combination is sort of the talk radio guy. I think that guy is a certain type. And then you have the high intelligence, maybe low testosterone, maybe low competitive, sort of womanly and sort of like this empathy and stuff like that. I think those guys tend to be liberals, right? Trump really matters for our politics. I think he's gonna probably the most likely scenario is he wins a nomination, probably loses the general, or he might win. If he loses the general, I think he's the nominee in 2028 and probably 2032 and probably indefinitely.
He doesn't die?
He's not. He doesn't die. No, he doesn't die. They run his hologram. Yeah, after a while. After a while.
Today's episode is with writer and political scientist Richard Hanania. Richard is one of the leading intellectuals whose voices and opinions make it to the mainstream, though he himself may not be a household name. He has a new book titled The Origins of Woke: Civil Rights Law, Corporate America, and the Triumph of Identity Politics. Richard sat with me for a wide-ranging, extended conversation where we discuss conservatism, diversity, and the history of the culture wars. Let's get right to it. Here's Richard. Richard, welcome to my podcast. Thank you for joining.
Glad to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
So, Richard, for my friends who may not be familiar with your work, when they ask me, hey, what's your great intellectual contributions, I typically point them to a few things. One is your Wokeness as Civil Rights piece or kind of series, and your kind of Origins of Wokeness, your upcoming book, which we'll talk about. Then also kind of the psychographic profiles, leftists and rightists, or liberals and conservatives. Liberals read more, conservatives watch more TV. Conservatives are more immoral, lower IQ.
No, that's a little bit of a exaggeration. Sometimes I enjoy myself.
I know. And then also kind of your analysis of kind of the gender dynamics and how that influences, sort of how dysfunction in organizations or just how things have changed in politics or in everyday life. And you had a piece on women, women's tears wins in the marketplace of ideas. That is also a playful phrase, but gets at some real things there. Do you identify with those as your greatest contributions, or what would you add to that? Don't be immodest.
Yeah, I think the wokeness stuff. I think I said something new and important, and that's why I'm writing a book on the topic. Greatest intellectual contributions. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, I think the liberals read, conservatives watch TV is something new. I think it's something that sort of strikes people as intuitively correct, but I think I put my finger on something that's sort of a constellation of things that sort of people understand, but nobody sort of put in one place and gave like a pithy, phrase to and collected all the evidence. The thing that originally, my first piece to get wide circulation was why is everything liberal? I am, proud of that one. I think it does explain a lot about our modern world. Yeah, I mean, I've done foreign policy stuff. I have a foreign policy book. It's okay. I think it teaches you something about American foreign policy. Definitely, it hasn't got that much attention, but that's another. It's also up there. And so yeah, I write a lot of different things, and people, sometimes they like really obscure pieces or they like the popular pieces. So I'm glad whenever I can have influence.
Yeah, and the TLDR of the foreign policy was that you use sort of the public choice theory that we use to analyze kind of domestic dysfunction among governments, and you applied it to our foreign policy apparatus. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's useful. I mean, maybe it's not that surprising to people who are not scholars of international relations, but I think people who are closer to foreign policy sometimes have had that sort of their minds sort of warped by the conventional ways of thinking about these things. And I think that a lot of IR theory has sort of led people astray, and people who are not international relations specialists might have never been taken in that direction in the first place. So some of them just might not be that surprised, but for people people in the field, I think it's a useful contribution.
So Vivek Ramaswamy, and we'll get into Vivek mania in a bit. He came on the podcast, and he said that he was enlightened by his conversations with you in terms of how he's thought about the origins of wokeness. Originally, he sort of kind of implied that it was this sort of implicit or emergent pact that corporations made to kind of appease activists without sacrificing profits. And thanks to conversations with you, has seen how actually it's more fundamentally rooted in kind of law that stems back a few decades. Why don't you add some nuance to what you perceived as his interpretation, and what is the actual reason in your case?
Yeah, I mean, I was, very impressed with the, from what I've got to know, from how I've got to know Vivek. I mean, just from him personally. I think, when we started to get to know each other, it was like slightly after I'd written an American Affairs review of his book, which wasn't a positive review. It was a very, negative review. I felt a little bit bad about it. But he reached out and, we talked about it and, we discussed the issue and we both cared about the issue. And, he was really open to the critiques, a lot of open to like a lot of things I was saying. And so, as he launched his presidential campaign, he's really talking about wokeness as law. I was on his podcast. It was just recently released. And, he wants to know about the executive orders. He wants to know about the exact laws, it helps. He has a law degree like I do. He's a graduate of Yale Law School. So just knowing a little bit about the law, how the legal system works, I think is useful here. It makes people more easily able to understand the larger argument. And Vivek, himself, brought the ESG issue to my attention. That wasn't really on my radar. But the more I talk to people, especially people in business, it seems to be something that's very serious. And Vivek was really the first person I heard that talking about it that I didn't know what it was, and I give him credit for that. So yeah, I think it's a sign that this stuff is breaking through. I see hints of conservative governors and state legislatures, going to work on civil rights law stuff. I mean, one is Texas just got rid of diversity initiatives in state hiring. I mean, what took so long? But the fact that people like 10 years ago, like diversity was just like, corporate, it was corporate. It's just like, just nothing. It was just seen as like fluff language. Nobody saw it as like anything sinister. And the strength of what's happened in the last, 3 or 4 years, is it's really become politicized. Now, if you say, we're into diversity in our corporation, it's like saying, we're pro-choice or we're for higher taxes. Like nobody would have seen it as, okay, this is a left-wing position. You're coming down and saying we're, with half the country and we're against half the country. Institutions generally don't want to do that. They'll do diversity if it just seems like, oh, it's something that everybody agrees with and nobody can be against. But the politicization of the concept, I think, has been something that's happened in the last few years, and I think it's a positive development.
Positive development in that there's pushback to it.
Exactly. Yeah, because if it's apolitical, if everyone just likes diversity and it's just seen as like baseball apple pie, then it's nobody's gonna push back on it. There's gonna be the corporations aren't gonna think twice, right? It's like recycling or something, right? Recycling isn't really seen as that ideological. I mean, leftists like recycling more, but it's really not. So like a corporation doesn't worry about backlash if it has a recycling program. Someone activist demands recycle, they'll at least pay it lip service. And all government institutions were doing this, and all corporations were doing this as far as diversity goes. And now they have to think about it a bit. I mean, there's hard pressure coming. I mean, from like what DeSantis is doing in Florida, what I just mentioned, they're doing in Texas. These state legislatures are really going after this stuff. Next time we have a Republican president, there'll be stuff that they can do at the federal level. And yeah, the politicization of the concept, I mean, is the first step towards changing things.
It is interesting. I remember I was finding notes that I was preparing for an interview in like 2016, 2017. And it was a tech interview. And one of the questions was, the host would ask it to everybody and every guest would more or less give the same answer. But it was like, what needs to change in tech? And the answer that I wrote was, we just need more diversity. And I just say that to say that it was so second nature. Like it was so unanimous, so obvious that it was both the morally right thing to do and that it was just organizations would do better. They would just like be more successful. And so how, as a student of this, how did this idea become so ingrained, like unanimously, when it's not, it wasn't like decades prior? Like how did that happen?
Well, I mean, so my book really traces this history closely. So, it's available for pre-order now. Unfortunately, it's not going to be out until September. But yeah, I mean, there was a general progression in that it started off just, they used to have affirmative action compliance offices. They used to have, just straight up, we're going to do not, if not quotas, then, trying to outreach to minority groups. It was seen as, corporations and government had a obligation to help Black Americans, or they tried to do something for women. It changed to a diversity rationale just with the Bakke decision in the 1970s. And basically, it was just like four liberal justices said, okay, with quotas, four conservative justices said, no affirmative action. And then just one in the middle said, no quotas, no making up for the past as a justification. But if an organization wants to use diversity as a justification to, do this, have this, feel good sort of concept and make the institution better, that can be acceptable, right? And so the concept of diversity only really takes off then. And diversity could mean anything, right? Like in practice, what diversity means. Anytime there's diversity, what they care about is they want more blacks and they want more women, primarily, right? So there's, Hispanics, LGBT, a little bit of that. But that's basically what it is. But if you don't think about it, if you don't like know the specifics of what exactly is going on, diversity sounds like, oh, conservatives you're underrepresented, get more conservatives. Oh, farmers from, farmers and ranchers from Wyoming, like let's have that. And like you think, veterans, like they're sometimes brought into this. And so like if you think, if you just hear diversity, you're like, oh, that's not like taking away from some people or giving it to others. That's not, it's not even a culture war thing. There's conservative groups that are underrepresented and liberal groups, but that's not how it works. I mean, we know from the affirmative action cases that go to the courts and, the universities have to hand over all their documents. All they're doing is giving massive benefits to blacks and then second most, to Hispanics and Native Americans and just getting demographic balancing. That's all it is. It's just old style affirmative action, but they've called it something else. This worked really. I mean, there were like 10, 15 years ago, like even conservative politicians didn't say like diversity was bad. It was just like a thing. Oh, you're into diversity. Don't be mean. And what changed? Partly, I think it was Trump came along. The left sort of became more unhinged. I think the diversity, like a lot of the crazy stuff people were seeing being said at like corporations and stuff. They could see that they were coming out of DEI bureaucrats and at the universities. So I think people really these people sort of overreached and people looked at what these people were doing. And then part of it was people like me and Caldwell did this with his civil rights book too, talking about making the connection between sort of law and what's been going on. Because if you know the history, I mean, the connection between affirmative action and affirmative action always been a dirty word on the right. I mean, then they and then people rebranded as diversity. Just if you know about the historical connection there, then you're not fooled. It's something that's very easy to see. So yeah, I think just sort of the dynamics of the polarization of our politics, these people sort of getting crazier and overreaching, and then people just going out there and making the argument has really changed things.
To add on to the overreaching point, when did equity get bundled with like I understand diversity and inclusion, like let's reach out to people who haven't been historically included, and thus you could make the case that hey, there's this latent talent that you want to include in your organization, and it's like an arbitrage opportunity. But then like the term equity doesn't feel like it like what is that doing there?
Yeah, yeah, the history of equity is, yeah, it's strange. When do you like? I don't remember this like popping up. I want to say around 2016, 2017. What you learn is like these, human resources is sort of like an industry, and they have their own trade journals and they have their own conferences, and this stuff, sort of all has like an underpinning in law. But these people sort of go in their own directions, right? Like they have different sort of intellectual currents and like practices and things that catch on. So I don't know about the term equity specifically, but at some point, somebody said equity and it must have sounded good and they all started saying that.
You write in your book the focus on woke capital as a cause rather than the symptom of what has gone wrong in our culture reveals a lack of knowledge about the extent to which government has put its thumb on the scale. What are the biggest ways in which government has put its thumb on the scale? And because I think the thing you're saying is, hey, people often say, hey, wokeness is a religion, but what you're saying is actually that religions stand the test of time. This quote unquote religion hasn't been tested, and in fact has been subsidized or enforced by law. And so, which laws? And you unpack in your book, but why don't you give a preview?
So yeah, I mean, there are a few here. So first of all, I mean, the Civil Rights Act most people think it's just something that banned discrimination based on race. It did do that, but basically it's been interpreted to require a disparate impact standard. So if I give, the canonical case is the IQ test, this was the subject of a Supreme Court case, and whites do much better on it than blacks. So take, the paradigmatic example people are always worried about. The burden of proof shifts on the employer to prove that this was necessary, that there wasn't something else he could have done, right? And so and it's not just IQ tests, but basically the disparate impact standard is very broad. If a police force wants to have strength or height standards, well, I mean, you have to think about women. You have to think about whether a lot of women are not going to be able to meet that standard, which they often are not. And so basically everything an employer do, and it applies not just to hiring but firing, promotions, is potentially subject to a disparate impact lawsuit through Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Hey everybody, Erik here. I'm excited to talk to you about a new podcast we have called In the Arena, where host Jesse Janae, founder of company Lumi, and regular set of co-hosts, including myself, interview leaders and entrepreneurs who've been through the ringer. Everything from major acquisitions falling through to major company scandals to cancellations to even people facing prison time. And we talk about the biggest crises of their lives and how they got through it. First interview is with Emil Michael, Chief Business Officer at Uber, who talks about the entire Uber saga and pulls back the curtain at what really happened. Second episode, already out, is with Austin Allred of Bloom Tech, formerly Lambda School, who talks about some of the biggest issues they faced along their rise. Upcoming, we have Martin Shkreli, the head of marketing at FTX, someone from Firefest, Sophia Amoroso from Nasty Gal, and many other entrepreneurs and leaders who've been through the ringer. Check out In the Arena.
When Elon Musk fired a bunch of people on Twitter early on, there was an article in some newspaper, like New York Times or Washington Post or something, where they said, they reported that from within Elon's camp or within Twitter, somebody said, you look over the list to make sure, they weren't having a disparate impact of the engineers you fired, right? Were too many of them, women or minorities. And apparently, Musk, to his credit, just brushed them off, right? There's discretion here. And actually there is a lawsuit. I don't know what happened to it, but there was shortly later announced a lawsuit over these firings. So, Elon Musk can tell them to buzz off, but, most employers, are not. And this applies to, the Civil Rights Act covers, basically every employer, I think 15 or more employees. So anything of substantial size, if you have 1 or 2 employees, it doesn't apply to you. But for most employees of any substantial size, they do have to deal with this stuff. So there's a disparate impact standard. There's massive affirmative action within government too. If you look at the demographics of, the federal government, I mean, minorities do very, very well, particularly blacks. I don't know if other minorities even do that well. But there's, massive affirmative action in hiring. They got rid of the civil service examination in the late 1970s, in the early 1980s, because it had a disparate impact. They never replaced it. Basically, government now hires just, sort of at random, and you can't fire them. There's a bit about that in my book too. So you have that. You have the government affirmative action and government contracting. If you're a government contractor, not a small group, government contractors include about 25, they hire about 25% of the American workforce. So a quarter of the workforce, you're required to have affirmative action. And they spell out exactly what that means. Divide by races, look for, underrepresentation, try to correct those underrepresentation. Vivek, has grabbed onto this and said he's going to do something about this, his first day in office. So there's another one. And then you have, harassment law too. So people who are worried about free speech, your employer, it's not just the employer that can discriminate. Other employees can discriminate. And the discrimination can be things like making the wrong jokes or anything that's called racial harassment. There's a professor named Eugene Volokh at the UCLA who points out that the standard says isolated cases cannot be, a reason for a lawsuit, can't create a hostile work environment. But basically, an employer just has no discretion other than to basically ban anything that might offend anybody, because you can't control every, employee, right? So it's like you can't tell an employee, you can make jokes as long as everyone else is not making jokes. That's not a reasonable standard. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, based on this harassment standard, comes in and says, if you're in any doubt, leave it outside the office. I mean, people are so like, oh, this threat to free speech is new. Like, no, I mean, corporate HR product of government regulation, has been there for a very long time. Now they're shutting down, speakers at universities, but like you just as a small businessman just wants to have a business and have whatever culture you want, have your friends and make jokes or whatever. That's basically illegal. And so yeah, you have the disparate impact standard, affirmative action contracting, harassment law. There's tons of others. I mean, I highlight these as the main ones. I mean, there's small business loans that go to certain that are set asides for certain minority groups. There's sometimes direct pressure, like the insurance industry will go testify to Congress and they'll want something done, and then Democratic lawmakers will start grilling them on why don't they have enough blacks in positions of leadership or power, right? It's just sort of this informal sort of nudge to to get them, move them in the right direction before they can get something. So this is everywhere, and if for people who I wrote this book and I thought about this because I'm concerned about these things like a lot of other people are. And I was just frustrated in how little sort of understanding that there was. It's just a religion. Like everyone just decided to do this. With no reason. They all just started talking the same way, like a bunch of zombies. Like we don't have a law, like we don't have governments, like we don't have incentives. And these are the things that these are the things to worry about. These are the things that you can actually change through politics. So I encourage people to try to do that.
Because one piece you also had is wokeness is a paper tiger, which is basically saying, hey, it hasn't been stress tested. How durable is diversity as a concept? And some people will bring the critique, like they'll critique kind of what Christopher Rufo is doing in with critical race theory or some of the other stuff, and they'll say, hey, you could change the law, but if you don't change kind of hearts and minds, like they're going to do the same thing and just call it a new name. One, I'm curious if you're sympathetic with that critique of the Rufo school, and two, like why wouldn't that apply here? Like diversity, at least in my industry, tech, it seems pretty deep rooted.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things going on here. So I actually wrote a piece, not critiquing the Rufo approach. I think it's useful, and I think Rufo does agree with this. But yeah, I do think that like the kind of things that you're teaching in public schools. I mean, the fact that those people thought it was a good idea to teach them in the first place is the problem. So get rid of critical race theory. They'll call it social studies or whatever. And that's why I'm a big believer in school choice. I mean, I believe in markets. I believe that the markets will generally reflect what people's preferences are, what people are comfortable with. I think competence is a thing. So yeah, the school issue, I believe in giving the choice to parents. The parents cannot possibly. Private institutions are more responsive than public institutions are, of course, because you can take your money, you could go elsewhere. Parents are not as liberal as labor, organized labor, or these other the sort of education establishment, education industries, education schools. I mean, just a lot of crazy things, and people don't have to listen to them, right? If they don't want to, if they don't have government schools, or they have choices for educating their children outside of government schools. And then and so like I think a good example here is I've been talking to people about this a little bit about Hollywood movies. Hollywood movies are subject to a market test, right? And they're not really as woke as, say, the kind of the academic departments or sort of federal bureaucracies. Why? Because people want to see action heroes. They want to see pretty. They want to see attractive people. I mean, they want to see heroes overcoming obstacles. They want to see normal human morality reflected. They don't want the morality of the San Francisco's DA office sort of. Nobody's going to watch that story because that doesn't appeal to human nature, right? And so yeah, I think that markets reflect choice and they reflect human nature. And I mean, and we'll get there. I mean, people can point to in the school context, people have pointed to like sometimes the craziest private schools tend to be private schools. So these like Westlake, Harvard here in LA. There's been like Barry Weiss, I think, has written about these things, and they're right. But if you actually look at the majority of private schools, the majority are either Catholic or conservative Christian schools. We focus on these very elite institutions, and they're important. They have a lot of influence. But the majority of kids in private schools are going to schools that are much more conservative than the public schools are. And I think there's a lesson to be taken from there. And I think the wokes aren't gonna the wokes aren't gonna disappear. I mean, this is a real thing that a lot of people believe in. The question is just like, are they able to force their views on the rest of society? And changing the law, I think, hopefully would prevent that.
Yeah, and there's a question of just like they won't disappear. Right now, they have like total monopoly, more or less, or over big companies. And the question is, how much diversity, to use it in a different way, would then be introduced. Like a related idea is this, there's this phrase like "go woke, go broke," and it would be interesting to see like a study of like Nike with Colin Kaepernick and like Bud Light with the thing that Dylan or whatever, like all of these companies who made these like decisions, and actually like what is the like how did it affect their bottom line?
I've seen anecdotes, and I've seen, conservatives will say it works, and then liberals will say, oh, it's, it didn't work. I've heard that the Budweiser stuff. I mean, as we're recording, I heard that it really did. There really was like one of those big falls that like can't be explained just by thing. I don't know. I haven't really looked into it, but it seems like the Budweiser things. Other ones like maybe Disney will go down, but like people say, oh, that might just be normal variation of the stock. It's very hard to prove. But I've heard that Budweiser is actually a lot, so you can tell if Dylan Mulvaney is different. That's actually pretty hilarious. If that was the line that once you cross that, that's it. That finally the masses rose up. This goes back to my other article. I mean, the conservatives just don't care as much. I mean, they don't live their lives according to politics. They're looking for the best deal or whatever. I mean, just the fact that I just wrote an article on Substack about like how Substack is the difference in Substack being a subscription based model while Twitter is an ad-based model. And I analogize that to conservative and liberal media. Like liberal media is a subscription-based model because they have people who will pay for it. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, these are institutions you pay for. Conservative websites are overwhelmingly ad-based, and they look terrible. They're just tracking you and trying to give you personalized ads. And so, yeah, this is sort of, inevitably, the people who care more are going to influence society. I mean, like people like conservatives seem to think sometimes that like, because they're, approximately half of the population, they should have half of the cultural, like they should just get they should just get affirmative action. They should just get credit for their numbers and just like, okay, corporate board, like we're going to represent you 50%, like, and then they could just go home and just like watch TV. Like, no, like the world doesn't work like that. Like at some point you do have to take, responsibility for the way society has turned out. And I try to speak up for my beliefs, and you do too, and a lot of other people we know do. But the fact that there's a lot more idealistic liberals who believe in something and are willing to sacrifice for it, it's just, I think, a fact of our world.
Vivek actually was talking about doing something like affirmative action for conservatives. You think that's a bad idea, right? It's just best to roll back the whole thing.
Yeah,
Or?
I mean, I think Vivek, I think he has something clever where he says, if you do DEI for other things, you have to do it for conservatives too. I think it's too complicated and like a little bit too clever. I mean, I think it's just best to roll that stuff back. Yeah, I mean, the idea that you're going to make political discrimination like a protected class. First of all, that didn't work for James Damore. James Damore tried to sue on this basis at Google, and they just said, "Well, you violated the civil rights against women. You made women feel unsafe, so it doesn't count. This is not a legitimate political view that you can sue based on anti-discrimination grounds." But it's like we need fewer lawyers, and fewer bureaucrats running our lives. No, less bureaucrats, less lawyers, fewer lawyers, more markets, and more individual choice is the way I'd go.
Zooming out a bit before getting into more liberal and conservative stuff, when did the brain drain happen in the sort of conservative part? Like, when did all Ivy League students or more talented people just become more and more liberal? Like, how did that evolve?
Yeah, I think if you go back to like the 50s and 60s, I mean, if you're talking about the most elite, they were there's a good book on this called The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement. And so like the American, the American Bar Association, like in like the 40s and 50s was sort of a force for conservatism. And lawyers were considered, elite lawyers were more likely to be conservative. And this book actually traces it to, there's a connection where sort of more of the elite with, the growth of government under Roosevelt and then Johnson, basically government became a big funder of sort of intellectual work and legal, legal work. So public defenders became a thing, but just government indirectly subsidizing, public interest groups. And it sort of traces the sort of leftward shift among like elites. I'm talking about, not like half the population, but I'm talking about sort of the bureaucratic, bureaucratic class lawyers, elite college students and so forth. If you just look at like college students, or college graduates, I mean, very recently, Mitt Romney won college educated whites. I mean, this was only 2012. Right. And so, they weren't really, split up. It was really the Trump era. I mean, the Democrats for a while had like the elite of the elite. But the complete brain drain from the conservative movement just started after Romney's loss, and I think it's gotten worse over time.
It's interesting because Vivek, in theory, could represent like a smart right wing, candidate, and yet he seems to be trying to appeal to that same base, or so, like taking a very different strategy than Mitt Romney, I guess, took. Like, is that just what you have to do to win the right, or like, how do we have a Mitt Romney or someone of that kind of like?
Romney had to go kiss Trump's ring. You remember this? Trump, like there was polls at the time showing that if Trump ran in 2012, he would be he would be the leader. So people were really into Trump already. Republicans were really into Trump already back then, and Romney got Trump's endorsement. Romney deep down, must have always hated Trump. But the fact that Romney, went out there and still, people knew that wasn't him, right? He still had to do these things. He had to still be sort of as, and like there's two different things you could think about what the base wants. There's like part of the base are just like activists, and they want most conservative, the most conservative person as possible. And that, that's at least has some intellectual, that could hurt in a general election, but at least has some like intellectual basis, right? And there's just a part of the base that just likes, the fighting and like the rudeness and the crassness, and, doesn't trust anyone who's too smart or, too accomplished. And, that's part of it too. And I think that latter, I think like 12 years ago, I think when Romney was running, 11 years ago, I think I think that it was like the ideological people, the Tea Partiers. I mean, this was what the Tea Party movement was about. It was like a serious ideological movement. I mean, it had beliefs. It wanted to primaries. When it wanted to primary someone, it was because they voted the wrong way. They wanted too much government spending. Now, there's primaries in the Republican Party. They're just over, do you worship Trump enough, right? Do you think the 2020 election was stolen? It's really not about the issues in that way. I think this. So it was a gradual. It was a gradual process. I think it probably started. I think I'm a little bit of a tech determinist on these things. The rise of AM radio. There was the Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s, and people like that. Gingrich, sort of rode that wave in 1994, and then Fox News comes out just a few years later in the late 1990s, and then you have TV and radio. And then conservatives are just very good at producing infotainment, and infotainment is not it can be used for issues. It can be used to make sure someone is ideologically staying close to what the base wants. But it's become over time more personality based. So this was the obsessive hatred about Bill Clinton. I mean trying to get him for the Monica Lewinsky stuff. I mean that wouldn't have happened in the 1980s, and it wasn't because of his ideology. I mean Clinton was a Democratic president, but relatively moderate, and they just hated him he was he was the devil incarnate. And why was that? I mean, I think it was just sort of this dynamic of sort of talk radio and then cable news coming along and sort of deranging the right. And then you had 9/11, and then for a little while conservatives sort of rode that wave, but this became much more in the culture, the terrorists are going to get us, the Al Qaeda, the whole blah. This was like sort of this gave conservatives a little bit of an advantage, but it was also it was leading them in the direction of just TV watchers dominating everything. And then Obama comes along, and it's funny because there's this subterranean racism that's there. It's the birth certificate thing, but it can't say that it's racism. It's just this sort of stupid birth certificate thing. Trump rides that, of course. The Tea Party with the ideological stuff comes in, and then the Romney wins. He has to appeal to these people, but he's still Mitt Romney. And then in 2016, sort of just the TV watchers and the cable news people, that just takes over because Trump is one of them. I mean, Trump is would be a better talk show host, was a more successful talk show host than any of these guys were, and sort of the party and sort of conservative media and what it was just merged at that point.
I assume you'd say that you can't win an election, or you can't have durable power without having some high IQ, mind share. So if you were in charge of sort of, Republican strategy over the next decade, I'd assume that would be part of your goals, is to regain some of that mind share. Is that true? And if so, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think so much of it is a style as much as it's substance. I mean, the Trump, it's not his, Trump was perceived in the among voters as like the most moderate Republican, candidate, right? He was seen, I think he governed with pretty conservative direction, but when in 2016, he talked about, protecting entitlements. He still talks about that. He talked about, the trade, these sort of left-wing positions. And so it wasn't like Trump was so conservative, he made everyone come out to be liberal. It was just that Trump is Trump. He has gold toilets, and he has supermodel wives he trades in every few years, and he loves McDonald's, and he's rude to people, and he's racist. I mean, this just drove liberals and people who like to see themselves as part of polite society, that drove them up the wall. Um, and so it's not, I think the abortion issue is actually unique. I think that one is actually the substance of the issue matters a lot. That I've written about that. But for most things, I think it would be more a stylistic makeover. Just if you wanted to put me in charge and how to focus to win, it would be more a stylistic makeover than a substance one. Just get generic white man in business suit, give him the most conservative, and just get a nice smile, give him the most give him the most conservative positions, and he would do better than he would have won a lot of those Senate races in 2022, right? The generic white male businessman could have won in Arizona, could have won in Georgia, could have potentially won in New Hampshire, but they motivated these much more flawed candidates, and that was the problem.
And then the flaws are, the focus on the stop the steal, which is stupid, and then also pro life, which is just as you've written about.
Well, yeah, but it's not even those. Even if they had opposite position on those things, like Herschel Walker's like illiterate. I mean, it doesn't matter what it's. I mean, people can see that this man has problems. I mean, this man hears voices. He has all these baby mamas that he pulls guns on. I mean, it's just this is beyond issues,
It
right?
didn't stop John Fetterman.
Yeah, Fetterman wins. Oz is interesting. I thought Oz came across as not that bad, but somehow it didn't work. But I think Blake Masters. I think people I think he appeals to sort of a lot of intellectual right wingers. I don't think there's any evidence that what he was arguing for appealed to the broader electorate. And then New Hampshire. I mean New Hampshire too. I mean I forget his name, but this guy was another one into the election stuff. Yeah, the election stuff doesn't help. I mean the pro life stuff doesn't help, and the election stuff doesn't help. But a lot of these people just were sort of there's a good analysis. There was some good analysis. 538 showed that like a good predictor of winning elections is having held previous office. So if politicians so a lot of these people were first time candidate, right? Masters was Herschel Walker's was, Dr. Oz was, and somebody who's like somebody with that background is much less likely to win an election than someone who's been like the leader of the state senate, right? These are the people that like McConnell would like to nominate, and I don't know why. Like there must be some skill in politician. At least those people have proven that they have those skills, whatever those skills are. Like it's not like me or you can sit here and say, "Oh, Blake Masters is a good candidate, and this guy is not a good candidate." We and you are not the average voter. I mean, most people who talk about politics are not the average voter. We're just going off of our instincts. So I think you sort of have to be a bit humble here and just sort of know that stylistically, what you think might sell is not necessarily what's going to sell, and you should probably be looking at people's track record.
Yeah, but there's a question if sort of the era of Trump and just the era of the internet, and how people build audiences changes the game in the sense of like, I know this is kind of even silly to mention, but if Mr. Beast was like, 12 years older and had the same following, could he like rally people to vote for him? Or is it like, could celebrities actually win? Like,
I wondered about that. So yeah, I think on the right there was an opening for it, just because it became like a movement about personalities in the media. It was sort of it was like that. Yeah,
like The Rock or Oprah or I don't know, one of these.
yeah, I'm surprised none of them gave it a shot. Dr. Oz sort of did, and it didn't work out great. I mean, he was, he's not at Oprah level, but he's a pretty famous celebrity. He tried, he won the nomination, and then he lost the general election. Howard Schultz, tried, dipped his toe in the waters, saw it wasn't going to work, and then backed off. Yeah, I've always wondered, like why Mark Cuban, maybe doesn't try it. Steyer tried it, but he's not. Nobody knows knew who he was before he ran for president, even though he was very wealthy. And so, yeah, I wonder the extent to which just being a celebrity is enough. Not everyone's going to be Trump, but yeah, like Oprah or The Rock, like I would be fascinated to what happened if they ran in the Democratic Party. I genuinely don't know.
Totally. If you were advising Vivek's campaign, besides telling him to be pro-choice, and center women's voices and be a good ally. What other advice would you give to him?
I think he's doing a great job. I mean, he's I saw you see the polls. He was always at 0. Now he's always at 1 or 2. That's something, right? He's getting he's at the same level as like Mike Pompeo basically, and like Mike Pompeo was like a congressman and Secretary of State. No one heard about Vivek until a month or two ago. He's doing well. I mean, he's got an uphill climb, but he's doing an excellent job of like talking about this wokeness stuff. I had an article specifically about Vivek, selling a positive culture war message. I think a lot of these guys are extremely negative. I think, like Josh Hawley, I think is a good example of this. I just look at it, it's just pure resentment. I mean, it's just like these elites, they're doing this to you, they're doing that to you. They're hurting the working man. I don't see any sort of positive vision. So Vivek goes out there, he says, diversity actually hurts merit. I mean, he's talking about, he's not just trying to protect people from these, big scary elites. He's giving people a positive message that is in the context of the American tradition. And so I think he's doing a great job there. And the production value. I mean, the podcast that came out with me the other day, I was surprised. I mean, he's really invested in these things, and so I think he's cleared like the first hurdle to make a difference, which is like get your name out there and be talked about. I just saw he was talking to Riley Gaines. So everything. This Riley Gaines, this woman is like getting canceled at the thing, and he's just having a podcast with her the next day. I mean, Vivek doesn't sleep, and so the next step is just sort of doing the retail politics thing well in New Hampshire and Iowa.
I'm curious if he's taking the right issue, like the climate stuff, just the stuff that he's taking on. Are these like popular? Does he have popular support for them?
Yeah, in the Republican primaries, I don't know if like climate is the big one. I mean, that seems to be a genuine belief from Vivek. But the wokeness thing, that's driving the party. I mean, Nikki Haley. If you watch Nikki Haley's announcement video, you think, oh, Nikki Haley is Mrs. Moderate, trying to be the establishment. All she's talking about is woke. I mean, she's really just going on about how terrible woke is. She says it's like, at some point, she says it's like the biggest threat to our country. And she has other disagreements with, the populists. But basically, like everyone understands that like anti-wokeness is sort of where the Republican base is. That's what's motivating them, and the intellectuals too. So he's seizing on that, and I think there's for good reason. And then he's doing the day-to-day things that people they care about, standing up for Trump's integrity. After the Alvin Bragg arrests him, they care about the trans in sports. Vivek is going further and talking about this trans stuff than a lot of people are. I think he does it in a right way. I mean, I think he does it in a way where it's like he takes the extreme position, but a lot of this stuff is like you can't teach. You can't just say do this or that. It's like the kind of person you are. Like Vivek is a striver, optimistic, successful immigrant, right? He's not an angry guy. He's not an angry guy from the middle of nowhere who feels the world is left behind. Or like, so a lot of these elites, like these people seem like lower level elites, like they're elites. They went to like good schools, but they're like a little bit more resentful of the liberals who are a little bit more successful than them. That's not Vivek either, right? Vivek, I think his personality sort of comes through. So he's able to talk about these issues, sort of hit what the base is like, what the base likes, but at the same time, not having a lot of the pitfalls that a lot of Republican politicians have. So I don't have tons of advice for him. I think he's doing a great job given where he started from.
You've written about how kind of anti-woke on its own is a losing position. It's not positive enough, and people don't want to be associated with losing visions, with losers in general. And so I'm curious what you think like a positive vision could look like that could have a constituency. Vivek is talking about merit and excellence. And while that's attractive to, perhaps some of us and some of our peers, like I wonder if that has enough kind of like, concreteness for, the average person, as opposed to someone who's having a positive vision of like, 2-parent household, like, just more like, or even Blake Masters saying like, one income per household. I don't know, something that's like more rooted to conservative values or something. How do you think about, or like lifestyle even?
I mean, if you want, a traditionalist lifestyle, you'll be a minority party. I mean, most majority of Americans don't want that. I mean, they would like the option of one parent working home. A lot of people already do that. But people aren't. There's not a big clamor to stop women from working out there in the public. People generally like money and like having 2-income households. I don't think as a country, I don't think that we are a big diverse country, and I don't think there's much that unites us. But merit and colorblindness, I still think that's pretty strong. I mean, I think people tend to believe that. I mean, I think polls bear this out. I think how affirmative action does poorly at the ballot box bears this out. So I think, yeah, merit, the best people are gonna get where they are, and like maybe the combined with the messages like this is part of our collective identity. This is what America makes America great. We're not some country that privileges some caste or some racial or ethnic group. We let people compete, and we let the chips fall where they may. I think that a lot of the anti-China stuff, Vivek is really into this messaging, and as are most Republicans these days. I'm not a big fan of it on policy grounds. I think it's usually leads to a lot of silly suggestions. But if to the extent that people need something like, oh, we'll be meritocratic and we'll have a successful free society, and that will beat the kind of communist Chinese who are coming with us with their balloons, which I'm not particularly scared of. But to the extent people do need something, I think maybe communist China as a punching bag might work.
You mentioned you're a believer in markets, and I do wonder if we were able to repeal. And I think you said that wrote about how a president could actually issue an executive order or repeal an executive order that could have a major impact. We'll get into that in a bit, but let's say that some of the laws that were sort of tilting the playing field were totally repealed. I wonder if markets would show that just diversity is a kind of an emergent strategy for at least for over half the population to rise up in their careers, and they really care about their careers. And merit and excellence like seem nice. If the opposite means that they will have a better career, like wouldn't they prefer that? Like, isn't there something structural advantage to, giving more than 50% of the population like better jobs?
Well, I mean, it's if you're going to give some groups preferences, I mean, that's inherently a zero sum game, right? So every single person who you think is going to get ahead through quotas has a person who's going to lose out. And generally, the people don't want to admit that they get ahead through quotas. So no, I don't think so. I think the idea, I think just to try it as an experiment, like talk to someone who's not very familiar with American politics or someone who doesn't pay attention to American politics, and just bring up the story that, oh, what the people into equity are doing, like they're getting rid of algebra class, because some group doesn't perform as well as the other. Like, just try that on like an immigrant, someone with no experience in American culture. It sounds absurd because it is absurd. I mean, and so a lot of this stuff is absurd, and particularly in the American context, when we're sort of the society which doesn't have a common ethnic background, or doesn't have a sort of a state church or anything like that. It's just inherently appeals to people, and it's part of the American idea. I mean, even the equity people, I mean, they don't say we should just get our fair share because we're black and we're 12% of the population, and that's just fair. I mean, they try to make some argument like it's going to help everybody, and it is the real fairness because racism is holding people back. And so, yeah, I do think this is a winning message, and I don't think the affirmative action, I think it has to sort of operate in the background. It's just too inconsistent with to explicitly argue for it is just too inconsistent with other values people hold.
Some people who are a fan of what Trump was kind of going for actually wanted Biden to win because in Trump, they saw someone who helped his enemies and hurt his friends. Like the New York Times, ACLU got so much bigger, and all these organizations just got so much bigger. And there was because he served as a boogeyman, and it's basically this implication is like, unless you have a way to win, you gain power, all caps, like don't even fight. My sense is you disagree with that.
It's pretty silly. I mean, because we have again, we're in April, and we're mid-April. A judge just just had a radical decision in Texas that took the morning after pill that's been on the that's been for 23 years been used by women. First time in history, basically a judge has overruled the FDA and said something is not safe. It has to be taken off the market. And so, that's not the decision I would have made. It's not something I'm happy with, but like winning actually ends up you winning because, you appoint the judges. I mean, we're really a judgeocracy where Trump had one term, he got to appoint three justices. Bush and Obama had two terms each, and were only able to appoint two presidents each. So Trump happened to be there when Ginsburg died. I mean, Ginsburg died at the right time to give him the third his third Supreme Court nominee, and they filled up the federal judiciary too. So the judiciary is really important. I do believe I've written about this too, that Trump did cause a backlash and maybe hurt conservatism in the long run. But look, I mean, it's the elections are the main game, and like the reaction to the election is also important, but don't mistake that for like the actual power and the actual ability to appoint people and do things in the world.
All I can say in my very limited field, and maybe this is just a casualty, and it's a small price to pay. But in technology, in terms of like the state of activism, like it got so much worse when Trump was in office, and right when he got out, things just got way better. Because before, if you were pushing back against any sort of left excess, they would say, "Oh, you support Trump? You're a bad person. Like you have to let this happen or whatever." And after that, there was just no boogeyman. And some people wonder if Dobbs was actually like a Pyrrhic victory, where it creates this boogeyman again, where sure you win on that issue, and for those people they care about that. I disagree with it, but like, does it cement left power elsewhere by creating this boogeyman? And thus, you should like pick and choose which victories you want to have, and make sure that they're like real, substantive, enduring victories for your party.
Depends on your priority list. The people who think stopping abortion is the main issue will say no. I'll sacrifice affirmative action, or I'll sacrifice tough on crime policies. I care about abortion. Me or you have a different opinion, so all these people will say they're maybe a conservative label, but they care about different things. So yeah, I think good strategy is to push on the things you care about, and then not try to have your movement hindered by the things you don't care about or the things you disagree with your movement about. About that, tech becoming less left wing after Trump is gone. I think I think what I remember the summer of 2020 was really crazy. When you have this this outbreak, this frenzy, that can never last forever. So 2019, 2020 was crazy, and just people, that always leads to a backlash. And people can't just maintain this, sense of like craziness, like 24 hours a day. They have to, they have to sort of move on at some point. So I wonder how much is just, accident. It was just going to happen. Like George Floyd was sort of the peak, and then things were going to change after that. But unquestionably, look, whether Trump in office or Romney in office is more likely. I have no doubt that Trump in office is much more likely to lead to a backlash and to make society more liberal. I think if you're a Republican, you take either Trump or Romney because you want to win and you want to do things. But if you have a choice between the two, I think you try to get the guy who's not going to inspire the backlash.
If you could rank the priority list of issues that would lead to Republicans winning, you would certainly strike abortion off that list because it's a losing issue for reasons you've written about. Would crime be among the first? Like for me, I wonder if like "What is a Woman" is like a rallying cry that could win popular support.
I don't see a lot of evidence, because a lot of people are not seeing the trans issue in the way conservatives see the trans issue. They really are seeing there's people with like deep problems, and they're complaining, and they feel sorry for them, and totally, what is a woman? You have a penis. Like, that works for conservatives. I don't know if that like
No, but they have kids, and they send their kids to school, and if they see enough libs of TikTok videos, they're going to be like, what the fuck, right?
Yeah, but most people are not watching, libs of TikTok video. I don't know. I don't know how representative that stuff is. Some of it surely exists, but I don't know if like people are seeing it everywhere in their lives. As far as like, what's a winning issue? Are you asking me what's a winning issue, or like what I care about?
Both.
I'll start with the winning issues. I think like we talked about, the affirmative action, civil rights law, the Vivek stuff that Vivek's taken up, I think is right. Yeah, the crime issue. If you look at, I think politicians generally know, what they're doing. So if New York Times did an analysis of the 2022 midterm, and Democrats all their ads were on abortion, or the majority, or the plurality, whatever. That was the biggest issue for them. And for Republicans, it was crime. And I think both sides are right. I think they understand that people want their abortion rights, and they want to be free from crime, right? I think that is the median voter. The thing about the Republicans, though, in running on the crime issue, is that there's not a lot. Well, this is true, I guess, for abortion too, at the federal level. Although the judges, it does matter for Senate races. The federal government doesn't have tons of control over the crime issue, but the extent to which you can make it into an issue, I think it's definitely worth talking about. That's correct. I think they should probably, I think that a lot of this, the entitlement reform stuff, I think Social Security and Medicare are heading in a bad direction. I really care about doing something here, but I know it's not popular. My suggestion would be just lie and say you're going to protect Social Security and Medicare, and then not do that. I think that was Trump to a certain extent. Trump tried to repeal Obamacare, and it would have taken away a lot of Medicaid funding. And this was Paul Ryan's dream, but it wasn't consistent with what Trump said during the campaign, and just barely fell short in the Senate. But yeah, I think that probably not running on that, going moderate on the economic issues, I think is helpful. I think the immigration issue, I'm friendly to immigration. I think it does help Republicans generally to run against, crime and disorder, but you've also got to do it in a way that doesn't seem mean to people. And I wonder if sort of being a little bit more accommodating to immigrants, is a good way to sort of, just to be harder on crime and to be harder on affirmative action and diversity stuff, because then people can't say, well, you're a racist, you just want to hurt minorities in every way possible. If you could hold this up and say, no, I'm not, I'm, welcoming to minorities who, play by the rules and contribute to society, of course. I think that can be helpful, but that's not where the base is. The base really wants to hammer immigrants.
Let's touch on crime for a little bit. You wrote a piece on I believe the invisible graveyards of crime, and you were referencing I believe it's prime minister or president of El Salvador, who's taken a very tough stance on crime as it relates to gangs in his in his country, sort of maybe implicitly recommending that like maybe something similar or even close, or maybe there's something we can learn. Why don't I let you unpack what you were trying to say in that piece, and what do people kind of like misunderstand about?
So the crime issue, it's crazy. I mean, we sit there and like if one person, gets shot by the police, and whether just sometimes seemingly justified and sometimes not, it must be 10-1, 100-1 ratio of what the kind of national coverage it gets compared to like all the crime in the streets. But look, people, dying don't, care whether they were killed by police or other or criminals. Crime has all kinds of effects beyond just like the victim, like someone was murdered or someone was robbed or something. Like people who've lived, it destroys cities. I mean, people flee from, the tax base flees from cities with high crime rates. Liberals complain about these areas that they call them food deserts. Well, yeah, I mean, because like it's not profitable to run a business because you have to worry about shoplifting and you have to worry about your employees potentially getting shot and all these other things. So crime is a major issue, and particularly in not everywhere, but in the American inner city, yes, and in much of Latin America. Yes, and these you have El Salvador. You have a country of a few million people, and it has basically the crime rate of some of the worst American cities. And so, like, what kind of politics would you demand if our entire country was Chicago or Detroit? What would be the price? The New York Times had had a headline recently. El Salvador, crushed its brutal gangs, but at what price? And it's like the price is worth paying. It's really worth doing this when your murder rate is 50 per 100,000 each year, right? I mean, the people can't live under those circumstances normal lives. And in this article, I just did a little bit of calculations here. And basically, I mean, you're going from Detroit to the American average in the murder rate. This is what Bukele did in the last few years. And like you look at the number of people he had to lock up to do it, and you just do a back of the envelope calculation. Assume some percentage of them are innocent. I'm sure it happens. I'm sure there are going to be innocent people who get caught up. But like, you're El Salvador. You don't have like a lot of good budget and well-trained police and like lawyers and well-trained judges and all this stuff. No, the gangs basically run your country, and you've got to figure out a way around this. We're in America in a much luckier position. We could do a real crime crackdown without major civil liberties violation and giving everybody due process. I'm sure we could do it if there was the will to do it, but we don't, and we can. That's convenient enough because most people in positions of power and influence, they don't live in the worst parts of the country. But I really have compassion for for El Salvador here, and like and really just dislike to see sort of this lecturing from the outside. And so yeah, I mean, I think Bukele's crackdown. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine. It's hard to make assumptions where this is not justified. I mean, these things are hard. These things are hard to calculate. So how this works, but I just like to say, make the assumptions you want and show me the calculations where this is not worthwhile to do. I think it unquestionably is.
How do you explain sort of like how would you psychoanalyze someone who worries about whether a minority is dying from the hands of police, but doesn't worry about sort of the orders of magnitude higher deaths that come just from like homicide in their own communities? Like, is it that they're just bad at math, or that they are uninformed, or that it's actually not about the minority? It's not about it's about something else. It's this other game kind of that they're playing. Like, how do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be to a certain extent. People are bad at math. I think that's right. But people, I mean, I think people who live in inner city neighborhoods, I think know, like their police aren't the ones likely to shoot them if they get killed. Yeah, and it's tempting. A lot of people, a lot of conservatives or moderates will blame, oh, these liberals, this luxury belief thing. They're the white liberals are the ones who want this. But unquestionably, the people in the inner city, I mean, they care more about, the police killings bring out the protests in a way that the normal everyday street killing It does not. And if you look at actually the voting results in these elections, it's in Chicago, like the anti-crime candidate didn't do as well with blacks. That's generally the pattern. I mean, blacks usually vote for the black candidate. That's why Eric Adams, gets the black vote. But it seems like they end up usually more on the side of the soft on crime constituency. So I think this is something real within these communities, and to the extent that white liberals also believe this. I think a lot of it they are actually channeling the actual preferences of black communities. I mean, they're not imposing the. I think sort of liberals are just too differential to black communities, if anything. If you want a take that's sort of like the opposite of what people are saying, oh, white liberals are doing this to blacks. Like, no, white liberals are channeling blacks. Blacks in the inner city are actually, do actually have these preferences. And the psychology, I think I think it's pretty normal. I mean, I think that a lot of black people do see, even if like the police are black in their city, and even if their mayor is black, they do see sort of the wider society as fundamentally a white society. Like they do see it as sort of a white man's world. And I do think they see authority as white, and I think it's like that too. I mean, I think Americans, they care more about a crime committed by an immigrant or a foreign country than they do their fellow Americans. And I think there's a lot of the sort of racial sort of solidarity in the black community that does lead to this.
How sure are we that being harder on crime, like significantly harder on crime, would radically reduce crime? Like, what does the data suggest from other places that have done that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard because like when we like, it's not like the American policy changes all that much between a Democratic and a Republican president, right? Like you're a cop on the streets, you don't notice the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. So, but I think that like we can look at the extreme cases like El Salvador, and we can see what happens. I think that it's not a coincidence that the Americans crime rate went up in the 1960s as we started going softer. I mean, in every way, like more civil liberties for criminals, giving them attorneys, giving them Miranda rights. This all happened at the exact same time that crime went through the roof. There's a plausible case. You look like, of course, like you have a right to remain silent. Like criminals will often just tell you like what they did and what other people did too. Like obviously, there's going to be a cost to this. Having to get a warrant. Putting more stringent requirements on whether you can search somebody, just not locking people up, letting them go. There's this sort of there's sort of like, why would people doubt this is sort of the question. And I think it's clearly that's ideologic. It's ideology that's leading. They don't like the idea that, look, someone is behaving badly, you create the incentives for them not to behave badly. You incapacitate them. You take them away from being able to harm society, and that has a disparate impact. And of course, and all that, people just don't like it, and so they're looking for something else. But I think it's clear from the plausibility of it and sort of history that this is how things work.
If you could wave a wand and change anything about how we did, prison reform or police reform or anything regarding crime, and your goal was to, reduce crime in a utility maximizing way, what would you do?
I think the death penalty is probably better than any other thing, and I'm probably using it very, very liberally, and using it, sort of making how far can I go? Making a spectacle out of it would probably be very helpful. I think society. You look at like these old cases, and like this murderer kills someone, and then like 6 months later they or weeks later or whatever they hang him, and it's like, what was society? What was like it's the deterrent effect, yes, but it's also like, what is society saying in that case? Okay, you've taken a human life. We're going to repay that, and we're going to repay that immediately, not give you another 15, 20 years and make you into a hero, right? We're going to take care of you. And I think that's sort of the negative attitude, and sort of the, okay, you're disposable now, we're going to get rid of you, I think is probably just as strong as shouldn't say just as strong, but also strong. The deterrent effect is probably stronger. But yeah, I think the death penalty I would make use of it. I think that facial recognition technology and DNA technology, Matt Iglesias, my and your favorite liberal, he's talked about this too. I mean, people don't like the facial recognition technology because of, again, disparate. But it's like, this is, what do you want? This is like perfect. You're getting AI to tell you who the criminals are, and you're getting them on video. And so I think we get more of this stuff too. I think Jennifer Doliak has done some stuff on like, DNA, collecting DNA of criminals, and like that really reducing recidivism. And so, yeah, there's, I think general tougher. I think more police help. There's a lot you can do. It's just, ideology prevents us from doing it.
So you're recommending, I believe, what scholars call the Michelle Tandler approach.
Well, I'd legalize drugs. I'd leave the fentanyl people alone, and then just get to the people who are doing the crimes, not the traders. But yeah, basically, her heart's in the right place.
Yeah, Elon was coming for legalizing as well, and I'm about to move back to San Francisco, and you hear these stories of crime, and one wonders what they should do or what can even be done, but it's certainly not the approach that
Yeah,
they're
but of
taking.
all the people to hang, why focus on the fentanyl? I don't know. Like, there's so many, the people who break into cars, right? Like, focus on there's so many. There's not like there's no shortage of people who do things to other people, right? So, start with that.
Some of our mutual friends, I was talking to them, they said that prohibition actually worked. Like, it actually reduced alcohol. Like, do you think that legalizing it would increase usage?
I mean, it's plausible. Yes. I mean, yes. I think that yeah. I think when you make something illegal, it's like not like people are like, oh, you ban guns, people only the criminals will find a way, or marijuana. Like no, like things that are illegal are harder to find. That yeah, and then not everyone is like MacGyver, like being able to find whatever they need, and that resourceful and that careful. And so yeah, clearly, but you know what? That's the cost of freedom. I mean, look, you have, I mean, you can get rid of alcohol. I don't doubt it would save lives. I mean, look, there's a lot of drunk driving. There's a lot of killings that happen when people are under the influence. Yeah, I'm sure banning Popeye's chicken would probably save a few lives, but whatever. Saving lives. I mean, what's like that's a dystopia. Like trying to save as many lives as possible. That's Xi Jinping during COVID, right? I don't want that. I don't want a society that's going to maximize lives saved. I think that's a terrible way to govern.
Yeah, you want to say it's going to maximize what?
Happiness and progress and wealth and liberty.
Just finishing the loop on the diversity, there was a school of thought that said that diverse teams do better. Scott Page, I think, has diversity difference, stuff like this. And I think they tried to conflate sort of like interdisciplinary thinking with sort of like racial diversity or gender diversity. In tech, they'll say things like, Pinterest could have only been like founded by a woman. It was actually founded by a man. But you go, like there's certain types of company. I believe a prominent woman invested in it, and she could only seen it. And black people or women are more likely to invest in certain types of things. Anyways, you kind of get my point. Is there any evidence for sort of the effect of racial or gender diversity?
Yeah, I mean, the evidence for this stuff I think is pretty weak. It's plausible. I mean, you can be like, but it's like it's a question of how much. Like if you watch like Mad Men, right? And like they were all like white men, they would like occasionally bring the woman in and say, what do you think of this? So it's like the question is like maybe you need a woman to say this seems wrong, or this won't work or whatever. But can you just get that from like asking your secretary or asking your wife or something, right? Do you really need if she's not the best suited to be the business executive, do you really need to bring the woman in? So no, I don't think there's a lot of evidence. But look, things that the markets are good for figuring this stuff out. I mean, like you don't need to force people. You don't need to force it on people. If it works, the only reason you need to force it on people is because there's some doubts about your theory, and especially academia. People know the replication crisis, but it's not just the replication crisis. It's like the way you frame the issue. Like academics will take like this thing that works in this very narrow context and say, well, this shows quote unquote diversity is good, right? It might just be some puzzle or something that has no relevance to any real world situation. And usually they can't do the real world test. They're too hard, and the world is too complicated. It's too expensive and all that. And so yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things. Great. I mean, great theory. I'm sure it works in some places. I'm sure it doesn't work in others, right? Do you need your coders? You have a very technical question to be gender or racial diverse. I don't see any way that would work. I mean, any reason for that? If you're making a movie, you want to appeal to broad audience, yeah, maybe. I mean, you want other people in the room, so it's going to be very context dependent.
I'm curious. Let's say affirmative action, gets repealed. Like in the next 5 to 10 years, how do you expect sort of these issues, kind of like the diversity expectations of equal representation in business and in sort of like how do you expect it to evolve? There's a certain generation of people that really believes it and believes it strongly, and it affects their careers in very real ways. So, do you expect to be further politicized? Do you expect what do you expect to happen?
Okay, one thing I don't expect is Vivek comes into office, signs executive, repeals executive order 11246, and they go and publicly fire all the diversity counselors the next day. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that next, you really do push back against race-based governments. Next time there's austerity, they're looking to fire employees. Those calculations are going to change, right? I think that future corporations, that there's a lot of turnover in the Fortune 500. I mean, capitalism is still a dynamic process. And so I think the next generation of corporations are going to come. They're not going to have these offices. They're not going to have these vested interests. People used to say, Google for the first number of years didn't really have an HR department, right? There was this, it used to be this stereotype of like, this tech is this unregulated place where these bros can do whatever they want. And I think that might have been true, 20 years ago, but the shakedown artists came for them. And they ended up changing the culture. I mean, I remember like the old shakedown regime where it was just very explicit, like Jesse Jackson says, hire more blacks, and they just give Google would just give Jesse Jackson a check. Now it's much more, it's much more elaborate. They have their, all the diversity people within the organization. And so, yeah, I mean, the next generation of companies, it'll be like what Silicon Valley could have remained if it came up in a world where there wasn't civil rights law. But unfortunately, there was civil rights law, and they got captured. So whatever the industries of the future are, I suspect they'd be less woke. It would have more impact on them than the current companies and established interests.
It'll be interesting to see. You've come across as very anti woke. You've been a leading writer about that topic, so people conflated you with right wing. And then as you were seen as more right wing, you started to write more about how people on the right don't read, and are lower IQ, et cetera. And half part of this is in jest, but you had a certain disgust on the right. Do you have kind of like and then you repudiated some of the ideas around, sort of being sympathetic to Russia or China, and you were kind of liberal democracy pilled. So you had a bit of an evolution. Do you see kind of almost like a reverse audience capture when a certain group likes you? It's like a Groucho Marx phenomenon of like you start to either dislike them or you just are more aware of their flaws.
Yeah, that's true. That is happening, and I wonder how much of it is just Twitter. I mean, it's not like the people who write essays like responding to me anger me. Usually they're sensible. But the Twitter, the people they're bad, and like I guess the wokes, they're not my network, right? So they're not dunking on me all the time. They're not fighting with me. It's these these conservatives, and I end up really disliking them, but I try not to have that be sort of the determining force. I think when you've sort of gotten it from like both sides, like you've had these mobs come after you from both sides, you don't have the illusion that it's all these innocent cowering conservatives and these big bad leftists who just want to cancel people, want to hurt people, want to come after people. No, I've had very vicious conservative mobs. Probably the worst mobs I've had have been conservatives. And so, yeah, I mean, having that perspective makes you understand that it's not just one group, victimizing the other group in American society. But I try not to sort of like just be driven by these personal grievances. I think I'm still able to say, like, look, I still think Republicans are more correct on most issues. So I generally do want them to win elections, just because they don't they don't meet my intellectual standards as far as like why they believe what they do or why they do what they do. I mean, I'm able to look past that. So yeah, you try to not have audience capturing, you try to not to have reverse audience capture. You try to just just figure out what the best ideas are.
Do you think it's a little bit of the mid-wit meme where it's like the lower IQ, but they're coming to the right conclusion? The mid IQ might be the left, and then there's certain people on the right who like have a better process for coming to the conclusion, but come to the same conclusion.
It's issue by issue. I think on the gender stuff, yeah, I think it's so clearly fake. I think the DEI and the woke stuff, like a really stupid person can see through it, and a really smart person can see through it. But no, I mean, there's certain issues where conservatives are just stupid on, and there's not smart people are not coming to those conclusions either. So it really is issue by issue.
I wonder. It seems that blank slatism is a core tenet of being an upstanding person in society today, and I feel like that's gotten harder and harder to believe, and that at some point it will just be like you just can't believe that and also be a thinking person, and thus like that will change on the left. Like, how do you see that?
Well, Charles Murray thinks this. Charles Murray thinks that scientific evidence will come in for heredity and intelligence and all this. But though, what I say to that is like, look, like, do you think that the evidence for differences between men and women are overwhelming? Do you think any other evidence will ever reach the level of the certainty of that we know men and women are different? And I don't think so. I can't see it. Like, I consider that the most proven thing that you can imagine. And still, like, it's when you look at STEM, why are women underrepresented in STEM? It's still, it's still mostly blank slatism is what you're supposed to say. So no, I don't think evidence is going to save us. I don't think any scientific finding is going to come back and say, "Oh, we found the gene." Like we already know about chromosomes, and we still think men and women are the same, and when it's convenient. So no, science won't save us. We'll have to argue for these things directly.
Yeah. I wonder if advancement in behavioral genetics might.
Now, nobody cares. The twin studies have been around, I mean, for, 30, 40 years. They're very convincing. They're very high quality. I mean, the twin studies, the adoption studies, I mean, they blow your mind when you first read about them, but nobody cares. I mean, it just hasn't made, I wish, one thing, I wish conservatives would use this stuff because it's actually very, very powerful. And like, you don't have to just say all experts are wrong and all science and data is wrong. You can say like, no, you have the bad data and we have, you have the flawed methodology and we have the good methodology for figuring these things too. But not many people have sort of the brains or the inclination to want to do that.
You wrote a piece, effective altruism will be woke or die, or anti-woke or die. You could have, substituted kind of any gray tribe group for effective altruism. And it feels like blank slatism is the crux issue. And to me, it feels like they're all conceding on that, or like there's no way they can fight back without being kind of out of polite society. Like,
Yeah, so I was recently at the Emergent Ventures conference for people who've gotten a grant from Tyler Cowen in the DC area, and there are a lot of obviously a lot of EAs there. And one thing somebody said that I think is correct is that like the EA's movements influence will not be as EA's, right? The EA's influences movement will be in people taking lessons from them, and I think that's probably trying to do something with it. So I think like you see like the hints of EA, like sort of, we see sort of like EA thought sort of making its way through different things. So I think that like, YIMBYism, I think there's a lot of overlap with these EA people. I think like an EA approach to crime, for example, I think you're seeing a little bit of people talk to that. They don't call themselves, say we're EA approach to crime, but just like doing the costs and benefit and not being sort of hostage to ideology. So EA as an EA movement is maybe not as interesting as like EA and what it does, how it influences right-wing thinkers and how it influences left-wing thinkers and people closer to politics. I think there's still a lot of potential there.
Talk about how you became liberal democracy pilled, Fukuyama pilled, and how you think about that in context of the critique that even Fukuyama to this day doesn't fully appreciate just how susceptible liberalism is to wokeness or far leftism because it doesn't have any brake pedals.
Yeah. I mean, the like to start with like the last part, wokeness. I don't think we should exaggerate like how. I mean, it's bad. I hate it. I mean, I wrote a book on it and spent a lot of time on it. But I'd rather live with a woke elite than a socialist elite or a communist elite or the other. I'd rather be trying to do the woke stuff too, even than like doing a new great society, like expanding government to the extent that Johnson has. I think you have more freedom under a woke governance. So I don't see woke as like an existential crisis for democracy. And as far as like how I became sort of democracy, look, it's like I think a lot of people want to believe that liberal democracy is is the best best system of government, and humanity doesn't have an alternative. I think the evidence for that, has generally been not as strong as people would have liked to think. I mean, you have examples of countries with massive economic growth and doing very well, like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. Now, when you look at these countries and you look at sort of like the human capital that they're working with, right? South Korea, is one of the most underperforming countries for like IQ relative to GDP per capita. So South Korea, when you consider it's made up of Koreans, is not that impressive. But I think that the two big, I mean, I think that China was sort of the big one because it's this, it's the second biggest economy in the world. and they've had remarkable economic growth, for decades. The greatest, improvement in people, in a large number of people's living standards ever, right? They had, 7, 8%. People say it's exaggerated, but it might be. But still, I mean, you can't doubt that, since the Deng reforms, China has seen massive, improvements in some ways. Society more successful than ours, say in like, crime and things like that. They don't have the kind of disorder that we have in our society, and so there was a plausible case that look, there's something to be said of the China model. Then COVID hits, and actually the China model sort of looks even stronger because China gets this thing under control. And like, there's these articles in like mid 2020 that like, oh, China's like, gone back to normal, and we're still locked down, right? Because they just crushed it. Like, wow, this is a really and it's still really impressive. I mean, how long they held out with zero COVID is really, really impressive, even if it's not perfectly reported or whatever. I mean, the fact that they could sort of contain this thing for that long was really, really impressive. But then it turns out years later, like they spent their budget is gone because they spent it all on COVID testing, and like they don't have money to do anything else. And they keep the zero COVID thing, forever after vaccines are available. They build a vaccine that's not very good, but still, I mean, it's probably good enough to go back to normal life. You don't have to lock up people forever. And their economic growth, slows down. You think they might be self-interested enough to do something about that. And not only that, but you see Xi Jinping talking like about sort of like this idea that capitalism has got out of control. Look, that's never good news. Look, like when your leaders start talking like that, they usually don't have something better. They're just sort of asserting control or trying to achieve equality, and it's going to make people worse off. And so you have this turn away from capitalism, right? And so China doesn't, I don't look bullish at the birth rate collapse too. Maybe they solve it. Like, this is another thing that maybe they solved it, but like if their competence extends to like they're very good at like stopping COVID, but not good at like increasing their birth rate, they're doing some things that are interesting, at least interesting to like watch how it turns out, right? Like banning men who look like sissies from TV. Like, maybe that's a good fertility like intervention. Like, I don't know. Like, right, encouraging women to actually have kids. They have this ministry of like women's affairs in China, and it's pretty funny. It's like, oh, 30 and not married, what is wrong with you? You're bad for China. Like, that's what you usually think is like a women's affairs office is doing. But they are doing this, and like, maybe there's fruits of that. If that fails, then you just get the tyranny without any of the plus side, without the economic growth, or without the reversing the birth rate issue. So I'm much less optimistic about China's future than I was recently. Russia, I mean, nobody thought Russia was like the smartest run country in the world at any point. But for it to screw up this bet, to have this sort of war that like the troops on the ground don't know they're fighting until the day before, and like isolate yourself internationally, and not even do that well. People expect you to just sort of roll into Kiev. I mean, the U.S. expects this, and you don't. You get stuck. You only break off a chunk of the country which everyone flints from, and nobody wants to live in anyway. And then the U.S. I mean, the U.S. bounces. I mean, the U.S. bounces back. I mean, the U.S. bounces back from COVID. I mean, it's there was like these articles like by Peter, like people like Peter Turchin saying we're gonna have a civil war. I always thought that was nonsense. I always thought that was exaggerated. And things look pretty good. And the point is, there's no alternative. Like the China, with the technocratic model, I think has failed, and it's actually was a reasonably seeming technocratic model. Like if you read about like the Chinese promotion system and like the standardized, the reliance on standardized tests, you think if anyone could have pulled off like a meritocracy that had a reasonable decision making, it might have been China. But apparently the system is broken in some ways, and so there's pretty good reason to think like we're not going to be able to do any kind of monarchy or whatever thing people are hoping for.
Peter Zeihan, for the audience, is a thinker who's gotten a lot of acclaim in the last few years because he sort of predicted U.S. Isolating itself a little bit, and his worldview is that what really matters in terms of determining a country's success is demographics, population sort of balance between generations, as well as geography and energy. And that's what he doesn't look at, it seems, is culture and governance, as opposed to Monker Olson's worldview, who I think is like all about institutions, why nations fail, or the Balaji worldview, which is about like human capital, IQ, and also like technology.
So is Zehan optimistic about Africa because they have the best demographics then?
That's a great question. I suspect he isn't, or I don't hear about the countries he's excited about are Turkey, Argentina, France. He's excited about countries that did well before World War II, that are independent, manufacture their own stuff.
Turkey's interesting. Yeah, Turkey I can see. Argentina, I don't know why you would think that. France has decent demographics, but problems with that too. So that sort of makes sense.
How would you describe the Hanania worldview in terms of like how would you rank order some of those things in terms of like what really determines a country's
It seems to be markets, and it seems to be sort of the inherent human capital of the population. I mean, you look at the Chinese; they've done well every single place that there have been Chinese. Same with Japanese. Koreans have South Korea and North Korea, and obviously North Korea is its own thing. But look, we saw it in Eastern Europe. I mean, the countries that basically the wall came down. These countries didn't have great resources. Like I never heard about great resources out of Poland or Hungary or whatever. But these countries did well. So I think that and I think that I'm more optimistic sort of about the world. I think it's like if you look at like sort of the sort of the decrease in poverty. I think that after the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we really saw just people understand that like sort of central planning wasn't going to work, and that the long term trend has been a move towards markets. And so most regions of the world, life has gone much better, and I think it's probably going to continue. I see the China's a big one. But that could turn around. But in general, yeah, I think that I think living standards are. I think globalization worked. I mean, like one of the things I think that people get so wrong is like globalization, screwed up and everything is much worse off. It's like no, like poverty like declined at a faster rate than any other time. People complain, oh, Americans. Look, Americans are still living better than they did a generation ago. There was some growing. There was some complications here, but I don't think our politics and like it going haywire was a result of our trade policy or because of globalization. I think it was a technology that with cable news and the internet and the social media that sort of drove people insane. So yeah, neoliberalism, Clinton, Blair. I mean, I think that's the path to success. I'd be more right wing than them, but basically, I mean, that's better compared to historically what's come before it.
So you're obviously pro markets. Are you sympathetic to the critique that there's certain cultural degradations that happen because of markets? And you mentioned in China they're trying to do I guess some government social engineering with around fertility or even like traditional gender roles. Is there a type of social engineering at the government level, whether it's encouraging marriage or encouraging people to have more kids or encouraging traditional gender roles that you might support because markets just tend to lean in a certain direction? Or do you think that that's actually not what's happened? What's happened is, in fact, it has been so tilted, and so we haven't had actual free markets in terms of culture.
The question is, what is the, if you dislike the direction that the culture has gone with, just with sort of a free market society, what is the alternative? And it's, you had like something like Iran, right? I had an article on Iran, right? They had it sounds like what the tradition tradcons wanted. You had a government that believed strongly in a moral vision that forced that moral vision on people. Like government with strong role in the economy, and it has a low birth rate, and the people hate the government, and the government just rules by brute force. And so the question is like, I like stable families, and I like people like not having tattoos on their face, and I don't know, I have these like sort of these conservative instincts of the things I like too, but I just don't see like I just don't see the path to government like being wise enough or able to really affect these things in a positive direction. I'm open to if you want to like subsidize births and stuff like that. I'm not totally against that. If you want to make if you want to what like makes tax credits to make marriage easier, I'm not against it. It's not the worst thing in the world. I just don't have faith that you could do much here without like really heavy-handed methods, and then even then, like Iran, it could backfire.
Yeah, that's as well put. Shifting gears here a little bit, do you think that there are people who are just like temperamentally or genetically right or left wing?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Look at Sean Hannity's head. Do you think that guy? Can you imagine Sean Hannity doing Chris Hayes' show and Chris Hayes doing Hannity's show? Can you imagine that?
No, I can't.
Try to imagine it. Yeah, these people were obvious. I mean, I think the physiognomy is definitely a thing. But yeah, there's these instincts that, of course, people are different. Yeah.
And how do you like? What is it about Sean Hannity that like makes him like his physiognomy that would make him more right wing, or like?
Yeah, it's hard to say. So conservatism seems to be, it seems okay, liberal. I mean, it seems like there are different types. It's not like there's a type, like there's a conservative gene or a conservative trait or a liberal trait, right? So it seems like a certain combination of a kind of man becomes a conservative. He might be smart but not too smart, and he might be very masculine, right? Or very sort of tribal in his instinct. And I think that combination is sort of the talk radio guy. I think that guy is a certain type. And then you have the high intelligence, maybe low testosterone, maybe low competitive, sort of womanly and sort of like this empathy and stuff like that. I think those guys tend to be liberals, right? And then for women and men, for women, it's going to be a completely different thing, right? Where the more masculine women seem to be more attracted to liberalism, and the more feminine women, right, are attracted to conservatism. And I think there's different types of like the IQ distribution and the personality distribution and between the sexes. So yeah, if you like want the behavioral genetics studies, I mean, they do show that ideology is driven by politics, and sort of I think these are sort of the mechanisms through which this happens.
And do you think the parties will continue to polarize on those axes, like just even more, or how do you expect the parties to realign, if at all, over the next few years?
It's inseparable from Trump. It's inseparable from what I think is going to happen to Trump. I really like, some people believe that like historical forces just sort of happen and like individuals don't matter. Like, no, Trump really matters. Individuals matter. Elon Musk, of course, matters. These people matter, but Trump really matters for our politics. I think he's going to probably, the most likely scenario is he wins a nomination, probably loses the general, or he might win. If he loses the general, I think he's the nominee in 2028 and probably 2032 and probably indefinitely. So I think it's going to be, I think it's probably going to be the Trump. I probably think it's going
He
to be
doesn't
the Trump
die.
party. He's not. He doesn't die. No, he doesn't die. They run his hologram. Yeah, after a while. After a while. No, he. I think as long as he's physically able. I mean, I think he could be the nominee. I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any natural reason to think it would stop. And so, and if he's not, he'll be a huge figure of the party. I mean, his trials will be the center of our politics, right? Even if he's not running for president, or if he's not president. So yeah, I think Trump is sort of an accelerant for these forces, and I think he's going to be there for a while. So I see it sort of continuing. I think yeah, I think the abortion thing is probably gonna contribute even more to this, and that's become that issue is just, I think, just started. I think we just started the politics of this, that's taken on the political realm for a very long time. So yeah, I think we've polarized, and we're going to be more polarized. I hope that like maybe the Trump show gets old, and like it doesn't have to affect as many parts of life. We can be equally polarized for people who are into politics, but politics can be like less of a thing. That like normal people are like, oh, you crazy people just fight. We're just going to do our own thing. We're going to have normal businesses and normal art and normal family lives. That's the hope, but I think the polarization, I think, is here to stay for a while.
Were you close to Ezra Klein's understanding of why we're polarized, and do you have a different view?
Yeah, I know. I think Ezra's pretty much correct. Yeah, I read that book a while ago. I'm trying to remember the thesis, but basically he points to the collapse of identity into sort of one axis, right? And I think that's correct. And I think that the technology is got to be sort of part of it. I think if you look at sort of the over time, you see like sort of the subscription numbers for the New York Times and the Washington Post go up, and like the other newspapers in the country go down. You have the cable news channels, and they specialize, the audience, or they find their niche audiences. So yeah, I didn't find a lot in that. I didn't find a lot of the book to disagree with. I think it's a lot of it's basic political science that most people accept.
I'm curious to get into your politics a little bit. I mean, you're definitely not a populist, it seems, but unlike kind of right wing elitists, you prefer democracy over like systems like integralism or Duginism. And your Fukuyama post makes that clear. And so if you're kind of pro democracy and anti populism, how do you think about managing that tension? Do you want the masses running things, or not?
I guess I'm just like a normal Republican. I guess then I guess I'm just a normie. I mean,
So like a Paul Ryan, Jeb Bush.
I mean, closer to that than either populists or wokes or monarchists. Look, it's so funny. Like the right wingers who hate democracy. Look, the only reason you people have any power or influence at all is because of a democracy. Like they think that like integralists will be running the country if we don't have democracy. No, it's going to be Fauci and Biden and Kamala Harris. Of course. I mean, like what is this? This stuff is sort of silly. I think democracy is like not like a real thing. It's like a spectrum. It's like we say, oh, somebody does something we don't like. We say, oh, that's undemocratic. But I think you need a system in which in which sort of people leaders can get feedback. And China actually tries to do this from like top down. They have this like complaint system, and they monitor public opinion and all these other things. But I think it's sort of it's a central planning thing rather than a sort of a spontaneous sort of feedback thing where like you can right now you have like a city government and you can go yell at them, and that's a way for like you can run against them and you can talk about them on social media. That's that. You can't just sort of replace that by like trying to figure out what the people want and then like sitting there in your in your room and then drawing up how to respond to public opinion. And so yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily like attention. It's like it's like historically, like the more the I do think that there is a problem in that historically, like there's been like a big government has expanded in democracy as time has gone on. I don't see like dictatorships having a better model, and then they also expand government because it seems to be that's what people want, and they also need to respond to what people want. They just do it in a more clumsy way. I don't see really an alternative. I think one good thing about democracy is it's sort of like if you look at something like embryo selection, right? Which I think genetic engineering that I hope is going to go somewhere. Like I used to think maybe China will be more enthusiastic about the stuff than America was, and now Steve Shu I think still thinks that, but I don't think that now. I see China. They came and they arrested that scientist who did the thing with the cloning, the baby where they inserted the genes into them, and like the U.S. is probably one of the most, or maybe the most unregulated country in the world for this embryo selection stuff, basically, because you can make as many embryos as you want to do whatever you want with them, basically. Although we do ban gene editing, and part of it is just like democracy focuses on other things, so it can't really crush like all the sources of progress or innovation. So I think that's sort of, and I think that like the development of big tech in the United States, right? It's sort of the same thing. It's not like Biden's or Trump or whatever, Clinton or whatever said that, oh, we're going to have this big tech economy. It's just that this new thing came up and like government was sort of too slow and too sort of clumsy to really pay that much attention to it. And then it sort of took off and it changed the world. Maybe that kills us with, AI. According to some people, but in most cases, it's actually a good thing. And I hopefully we'll have more of that.
I'm curious how you make sense of the Elon Musk kind of political phenomenon, and if you think it's a kind of winning strategy to kind of become, pretty heavily partisan, but to do so from a place of just like higher IQ, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that. I mean, I think works. I think that like people are too sort of wedded to the idea that there's like these people called conservatives and there's people called liberals, and like on one side, you just sort of have to figure out the best strategy for beating the other side. And I believe it's more dynamic than that. I think what conservatism is affects what liberalism is. And whatever liberalism is in a specific moment affects what conservatism is, right? So conservatives did not care about women's, they were not passionate defenders of women's sports, right? Until the trans issue stuff. Liberals, they weren't even that pro-immigration until Trump came along and then made them pro-immigration, right? I think one question people should always be asking isn't just like how my side should win. Maybe that's the right question in an election, because an election is just a zero-sum game that happens every 2 or 4 years. But like the rest of the time, they should be asking, me as a conservative or me as a liberal, how can I make the other side the most tolerable, version of themselves? Or maybe you want to make them worse because you want to backlash and you think you'd win through some complicated thing, whatever. But you've got to be thinking of these things. So the Elon phenomenon, I think, is interesting. I think when you have somebody of unquestionably, like nobody can question his intelligence or his success in life. It's definitely a PR coup, for your side if you can get him on your side, unquestionably. His behavior, though, I mean, probably negates a lot of that. Right? He changes, he changed his Twitter name to Harry Balls, and okay, so now he's playing into conservatism is like he might be smart, but look, he's got the emotional maturity of a 5-year-old, and like it's very easy for liberals at that point to sort of brush it off. So I was excited, like, oh, Elon Musk becomes conservative, maybe this has a big change, but I think sort of his personality has sort of played into some liberal narratives about conservatives and how he's acted, and probably it's a wash at that point.
You were mentioning earlier that people matter, people change the course of history. One debate we had in a group a long time ago was, do ideas matter, or is it, you had this phrase once, it was like hormones, cope, and something else I can't remember. reflect on or unpack that kind of debate, and where did you net out on it?
Yeah, so I mean, people like I think that this is sort of a theme, and I spell this out explicitly in my book on wokeness. There's a kind of guy who likes to like read philosophy, like, oh, there was Rousseau, and there was there was Marx, and there was Thomas Jefferson, and there was Locke, and like society is just like the aggregate, the aggregate of like 10% Marx and like 60% Jefferson, or whatever it is. And I think that it clearly doesn't work like that. If you look at sort of what wokeness is, there's no philosophy. You could tie it. Oh, the Gnostics. Oh, somehow it's Rousseau. Somehow it's Marx. Like nobody was saying that before wokeness. Like nobody was saying in 1950, oh, I've read Marx, and this is going to relate to transgenderism, right? The people are just, they're just sort of reverse engineering because they see what's happened, and so that they can go back in time and say this was caused by some philosopher,
The Germans or something, yeah.
Yeah, the Frankfurt School. I mean, it's like they they said it's like some of this stuff. I mean, and of course you'll find somebody who did say something that sort of looks like today, because people say all kinds of things, right? It doesn't mean that person caused it. I think people who are interested in ideas tend to think ideas are important. My sort of study into wokeness shows that it's actually often not ideas. It's just sort of bureaucratic, sort of, it's sort of people responding to sort of bureaucratic initiatives, or responding to a certain election, or trying to get voters in some way. It leads to this law that leads to this like industry popping up, and then this industry sort of justifies what they wanted to do in the first place. And so, yeah, I think that I think the Trump movement is another sort of example of this. It's like Trumpism wasn't a thing until like Trump came along, right? And then people will go back and they'll graft their own sort of explanation. Oh, it was, upset about trade, or it was this, or was that. I mean, Trump just had some instincts, and then people like this guy who didn't have like a coherent philosophy, people just sort of could make something up around that, and they claim the mantle of Trumpism. So ideas, I think ideas are important, like I think like abolition or something, like a very specific, like pro-life, could be in this category. It's like a specific cause that people take up and that gets put on the radar, and people can change the world that way. But these like obviously Marx. I mean, obviously Marx doesn't exist. There's no Marxism. Obviously, that's another clear case of that. But the idea that some ancient philosophy, some philosopher said something about liberty, or said something about there's some debate between the Pope and the Protestants of the 1600s that today explains our politics, or something like that. I just don't see a lot of evidence for that. I think it's very easy to sort of just see patterns here where none exist.
It is interesting putting those etymology or whatever of these ideas aside. It is interesting how colleges are just so good at kind of indoctrination. Like I remember myself, I was 18 going to college, had like zero political beliefs, or pretty and then after college I was just super woke. Like I didn't even think twice of it, and I didn't study the critical theorists or whatever. Like there's just something. University of Michigan.
Okay, and did you see that other pattern? The kids you came in with, did they all end up woke too?
Yes, yeah. I mean, University of Michigan is super. Like there was a conservative like club or whatever, but they were losers, and it just like this was. I went to college during Obama's election, first election. It was pre like I went to college in 2008, so it was pre like severe wokeness, but we were definitely like talking about diversity. Like we were definitely like left on so many issues, so much so that my dad threatened to like not pay for my college as an immigrant. Yeah, I don't know how they did it, but it just seemed. Is that not your experience or your perception of people entering college?
I don't know. I mean, I've always thought that there's some research that suggests sort of that it doesn't change all that much. Like if you look at freshmen versus, I think I went to college around the same time, and I think the Obama thing was unique because Obama really captured the imaginations of young people. So it might have just been the time. It might not have been that the college actually brainwashed them. I mean, it's my recollection of college is like most people did. They followed their inclination. There was a committed few who were really into like what, they're like these people worship authority. So like their professors would talk about some like crazy feminist or something, and they would get really into it. Right. That was, like in my, not very good school at the University of Colorado. There was a few people like that just really and then they would congregate in a few departments, like the real crazies. They would go to like women's studies or something like that. And then I remember like most of the other people just sort of being apolitical. Although now that I look back at it, I did work in the mailroom at the University of Colorado. So I did see that when people's voter registrations came in the mail, And I was able to just look at them because they're just a postcard you could put in the box. And I tried to find a Republican actually. And it was funny. I went through dozens and dozens, and every single one was a Democrat. So yeah, did the University of Colorado students around 2008, did they 100% of them come into college as Democrats? Highly unlikely. I mean, but again, this was also the Obama era, and maybe Obama just captured the imagination of the youth. So I don't know. I did notice that the University of Chicago Law School is sort of an opposite thing, because the University of Chicago Law School is very into law and economics. Like there's a very strong connection between the legal for law school and the economics departments. A lot of professors teach in like both areas. And so like people would like we would be incorporated in class. Okay, like if you have this law on contracts or torts, like how does it, affect economic growth? And like even like we had a lot of professors who were like, I don't want to hear about what's fair. I don't want to hear about equitable. These were like the professors teaching these classes, that all the one else had to take. And I did notice a little bit of a brainwashing too in the conservative direction, and that people would use more sort of economic language to talk about things. And so, yeah, I think I probably agree with you more than I disagree with you. I'm a little bit confused by the literature, which suggests that this doesn't exist, but intuitively, I think experience tells me it does. So, yeah, I don't know.
Building on your point, sort of the conversation around do ideas matter? What do you think about the claim that actually, sort of far left ideas are really like a series of tactics for a group of people to just gain power within an organization, especially like young people, to rise up, and just like, are you sympathetic with that?
I mean, it is part that, I mean, there's all these ways to understand conservatism and liberalism in politics, and like that does happen. That does happen unquestionably, right? And you need the ideas to sort of make that work, right? If you try to, like, woman goes and crying 1950s, like, they put her in a mental institution. They say she's got problems, right? Today they give her the keys to the company, right? So obviously there needs to be some kind of like background for things to work this way. So yeah, I mean, I think I think that like to conceptualize sort of liberalism and wokeness as kind of a generational warfare, particularly, I mean, it sort of becomes inevitable, like maybe not inevitable, but sort of much more likely when you're like, if you're a liberal white male, like what do you say, right? All the women and all the blacks in your organization are against you and saying, you've hurt me in some way, and your entire ideology says that white males are oppressing, women and minorities. How do you even defend yourself? It's very difficult. So it's unsurprising that, yeah, people would take advantage of that.
Shifting topics a little bit, I'm curious how you see the conversation on feminism evolving. Like if you compare where we are now to where we were during the Me Too era, it feels like there's like a reactionary feminism, movement that has emerged. The Louise Perry, case, the Mary Harrington, and Mary Eberstadt way before her. I'm curious if you think this kind of, put aside that specific movement, but just like reactionary feminism or pushback to feminism within women has legs, or like how do you see feminism going forward?
I mean, this reaction seems to me to be in like an online movement. I don't see any like politician who's standing up and calling herself a reactionary feminist, or any male politician saying, "Oh, I represent these women. These reactionary feminists are my kind of woman." Like, no, it seems to me that like what's going on with women in politics now is a big focus on the reproductive rights issue, and the sorting by sex, and then like, yeah, I see anything sort of, is there anything beyond that that's
Your prediction, I believe, is that going forward, women won't be as high positions as they were, or with as much frequency, if there is in fact a level playing field. That's I'm predicting that.
oh, so I'm assuming affirmative action goes away. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I'm guessing that that's the prediction. And if that happens, like how will feminism respond? Will they like triple down harder on that as a tactic? Like what do you think?
I think that movements tend to sort of, I think they may be so distracted by the abortion rights stuff that they might just not focus on that. I mean, I think this stuff is huge, and I think it's going to be going, I think that there's going to be, the pro-life movement's going to be going for in vitro fertilization. I mean, there's already some talk of that, maybe birth control, even if it doesn't happen at the national level, it'll happen at some state level, or there'll at least be talk of it, and that will grab people's attention. What if there was like, if there was sort of a rollback of civil rights law and women were not that represented, would that make them double up? Look, I don't think they're that represented in like corporate boardrooms now. I mean, I think it's still pretty male in like the Senate, and stuff like that. Other positions of power tend to be pretty male. And so it doesn't seem to be that strong of a correlation between it's like, hey, you have a critical mass of women and they change the culture, right? But the culture never moves to 50-50 just because men and women are different, and more men will be able to attain the highest positions possible. I do think that there's got to be some kind of, I think that like the trans thing, which is primarily a young woman thing, I think does reflect some kind of something very deeply wrong is going on here. Like there's so there's the it could be in some way that women being encouraged to be exactly like men and seek the exact same thing men want. They just decided they were men, I guess. They just decided they were biologically men. They were men, and so they changed their genders. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a response to something deeply, deeply unnatural. I think that the trans thing and the women's thing is not necessarily easy to separate. I think the next generation of like people who's going to see like these older people who like had these these surgeries and these other kinds of things. I think it's going to create a backlash. I would be I don't think trans can increase indefinitely. I think this thing is just sort of is going to sort of play itself out, and maybe we get a sort of a more reactionary feminism at this point, but that's generational terms. I think in the media terms it's going to be reproductive health issues that are going to dominate.
There's a certain claim that says that the world, or at least the US, let's say, just tends to, or is moving leftwards over time. And there, there's some, like, it's like a hockey stick, which has some, pushback, but it's never like big enough to, offset the gain. And we're just on a road to pedophilia and bestiality and all these things that conservatives like are concerned about, like what's after T. And then like, if you reflect back to like what conservatives care about over 40 years, it's like, well, Christianity, marriage, gender roles, like a lot of things that were like core to how they live their lives have been gone. You have a post that recognizes that actually conservatives have some wins. You mentioned abortion, gun rights, a few others in there. My sense is you are very skeptical of the idea that the world is just, or U.S. is just moving left, and that's why you're more comfortable with the idea that there are brake pedals. It's Jonathan Haidt might say some things like this, or Tyler Cowen. Like once leftism just gets a little bit too crazy, it will just like naturally offset itself, and so that's why you're more okay with a woke elite than like a socialism elite, because you don't think the woke elite will get much worse than it is today. Is that an accurate summary of where you're at?
Yeah, so I mean, whether things are always getting liberal, I mean, I think it depends on exactly what you're talking about. So, because when conservatives is focused on specific issues, right, guns or abortion or something, homeschooling, they have victories. I mean, they do normal politics and they win in normal politics ways. Now, if like your definition of conservatism is society has to be more religious. Conservatism hasn't done that, but no society has done that. I mean, every society. I mean, like you have to just sort of accept that some things are sort of a natural part of progress, and that like every society, like look, when people get more exposure to the world, they get more exposure to ideas, they get wealthier, they get more secular. I mean, that's just life. I mean, the rural areas, and I'm sure if you go to the Middle East, you go to Muslim countries, the rural areas are much more religious than the urban life, right? And people are being urbanized, they're getting wealthier. This is just sort of the natural thing with the internet. I think the internet probably did made religion. I mean, now you can like sort of, your priest makes a claim, you can sort of Google it. I mean, it's inevitable that's going to create some doubt in people about the faith that they're raised in. So yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. So if you're talking about religion, I think yes. I mean, the idea that. But if you're talking about gender roles more specifically, so if you look at like women participation in the labor rate, it's been pretty, it went up in like the 60s and 70s. It's been pretty stable. I mean, it seems like we've determined that like as a society, 65 or 70% of women work, and it's not going up to 100%, right? A lot of women don't want to work. A lot of women want to be stay-at-home moms. So that, that number of, women in the workforce, percentage as a percentage hasn't edged up. And so, that's a sort of indication that people are still sort of, to a large extent, living, traditional lives. So it really depends on, what you're talking about. I mean, wealth is sort of, leads to people being able to do what they want. And I think there is a human nature and people do want things. It's not, these people, the idea that it's all mimetic. Like if we just tell people to want a traditional society where they're all sitting on the farm and, they don't, the women don't work and they have 10 kids and, they just go to church every Sunday and, that's the life. And we just tell people that's the life they'll want. That's the life they'll want. I mean, I don't see any evidence of that at all.
That makes sense. There is an increasing group in technology, but also probably more broadly of people who are, anti-woke, but they're also, not traditionally right-wing in the sense that they're pro-choice, they're pro-immigration, they're pro-gay marriage, they're pro-technology, technological growth and economic growth. Well, one, do you agree that that's an increasing, set of people? Do you think that those people are politically homeless, or would they find a home in being a majority in the left or the Democrat or Republican Party?
So Mark Andreessen doesn't think these people exist. Do you think these people exist? He thinks it's like 3 people, and we're extrapolating from them. Are there a lot of tech right wing people?
Well, they wouldn't call themselves right wing, but they're anti-left. I think they exist. I think it's open question. Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 30%? I don't know. I mean, it's the Gray Tribe, right? Like, how big is the Gray Tribe? And is there ever a constituency for the Gray Tribe, right? But like Elon might have been part of this Gray Tribe, like, and so could the Gray Tribe take over the Republican Party, basically?
Oh, if they wanted to, yeah, I think they could. I don't see anybody trying to do that. Yeah, I think that well, could they take over? I mean, look at Peter. Look at Peter Thiel funded. He basically bought 2 Senate seats. Well, one, but then one got the nomination in 2 seats, right? And that's incredible. I mean, to just do that, one guy just doing that. So I think the political system is pretty open. And he started with he started with these guys who are outsiders to politics, working with established politicians. There's probably an even a greater a greater return to that. So yeah, I mean, if there was a real movement, it's like, what do you need? You need money, you need ideas, you need cultural cash. Yeah, I mean, people in tech have that. So the prominent people in tech, I think if they, the world is open to them, if they do want to look at me. I mean, I've influenced politics. I've influenced Vivek, and who am I? I have nobody. I have nothing. And Vivek is now saying he's going to repeal, EO, and he's sure to be the next president. So that shows you. I mean, look at Rufo. I mean, there's these people who with a lot less than a lot of the tech guys have, making a big difference.
Charles Murray had this tweet recently, and you wrote about it, where he said, "Hey, we need religion," and you wrote about men need sex, not religion.
They do.
That's
Need,
not the right headline.
they do. Yeah, they need sex and violence. I think I might have been a little bit more provocative.
Unpack what you're trying to say in that piece and why you disagree with the Murray analysis.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, these people a lot of the people who think society needs religion, they tend to have be doomers about where society has gone, and I just don't see the evidence that so the GDP is growing. I mean, people, there's something bad happening with like teen girls and young women, right? But like most people, yes, there's overdoses, but 99% of people are not addicted to to fentanyl or whatever. The life expectancy is basically fat people eating too much, and then the drugs too, right? And so, like, most people don't seem, societies don't seem like they need religion. I mean, European societies they're more secular than we are, and they're not having the decrease in life expectancies because, again, they don't need it much, and they don't have they don't have as much access to opioids, right? And so I don't see this sort of broad trend that humans really need religion. Now, there is a correlation where like religious people are happier. At the same time, like the areas that are least religious, they tend to have, the better economies, and that's where people want to get to. People are emptying out of sort of religious regions and areas of the country and area of the world and going to secular places. Man needs something, right? Like, it's not just, people are going to be, people can't just, I think, want to make as much money as possible and sort of, just live this sort of sanitized life. But I think people are pretty good at sort of finding that meaning, right? Like, people, get married even in countries without much religion. People, they have sex, they chase, well, maybe not like Japan, but like, most of the other countries in the world, they have sex. They get into other things, it could be sports, it could be politics. People get into hobbies, their career. And that seems to give people meaning. Now, these people want like, like, I think a lot of like intellectuals, like right wing intellectuals, think that people need like cosmic meaning, like I'm gonna have to live forever, and the universe cares about me. And maybe some people do need that. Clearly, some people do, because it's just too depressing to sort of not think that way. But I don't see evidence that like the majority of people or all people need that.
And I think what they're also saying is that, yeah, we find it in politics, and that's bad because that leads to, all this tribal sort of warfare.
I mean, look at, they think the first half of the 20th century was a time of, wise politics. No, I mean, I think you have to sort of compare it to these things.
So, I mean, some people would say that like the new atheists were making a big mistake, or they were, not appreciating kind of the fundamental, religious nature of human. In that, if you repeal religion, they'll just like find it in other places. Do you think? Do you sympathize with that critique of new atheists?
The new atheists, I mean, I think were interesting because, I agree with them on like a lot of like specific, probably most specific issues that they're worried about, the things that they don't like religion for. But I think they are not taking enough account of human nature and sort of what people need. So, I say everyone, like society doesn't need religion, but I would never say that like nobody needs religion. Like if we, like everyone could be Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens and like be happy. Like, no, obviously for some portion of the population, they really do need it. And I think, so I think that was the mistake. As far as the new, I mean, it's very interesting because this was sort of, they were responding to two things, right? They were responding to the Christian right, and they were also responding to Islamic extremism. This was after the years after 9/11, and so they were fighting this like two front war, and it sort of went out of style because everything became about whiteness, right? And so like you couldn't criticize the non-white people, and so like the world sort of left them behind, right? And so like there's no like place for them. You have like these sort of the right wingers who are sort of more identitarians themselves, and like more sympathetic to Christianity, and these left wingers who just think anything, but at the same who think anything non-white is good. At the same time, I mean, Islam did, they were sort of wrong in that, like, I don't know if they were wrong if they made a prediction on this, but Islam did sort of mellow out in Europe. Like the terrorism thing did not, they seem, to be mostly assimilating. Germany, I mean, Germany was supposed to fall apart because of the all the Syrian refugees. It seems like it, the crime rate, I just saw, the stats recently, the crime rate didn't budge all that much. And so, yeah, I mean, new atheists are sort of an interesting sort of time capsule. And like, it's interesting to think about how, like, why they don't really fit in our modern categories.
Speaking of amount of categories, going back to the liberals and Republicans, sort of strategies for it to have kind of their own, some people use the word client base, or kind of, electorate. The left tends to go for sort of the minority population, and the right tends to go for the San Francisco called middle American radicals. But the challenge with that is it perhaps creates the kind of populism that you're less excited about. And so I'm curious, like, what you think is a path for the Paul Ryan or normie Republican.
I mean, I think they can learn from. I mean, I think they can learn from Joe Biden. I mean, Bidenism is like more of a stylistic. I thought I saw you. I think Brian Chow talked about this in your conversation with him. Biden is more a stylistic revolution. He's way to the left of Obama, but has less of a backlash than Obama, right? And part of it is like his white privilege. I think that's true. I think that Obama really was like sort of did rub a lot of these right wingers the wrong way because of his race and his Ivy League, all that stuff too. But yeah, I mean, he really defagged a lot. Has been a successful politician, had a very successful midterm. I mean, given the circumstances, and is probably the favorite for 2024. And so yeah, I think that like style and substance can be completely different things, right? I mean, I really think that like. Look, there are Republicans who win at the state level who do very well. They tend to be, boring guys who are not the guy, the ones who get all the attention or who are not the best at getting Twitter followers. So yeah, I mean, there's, if you're a conservative, if you're a conservative, the main hindrance to doing this though is the base and what they want. The question is, are they so disconnected from reality that like nothing matters? Like maybe you could like with a highly educated electorate, I think the Democrats have this. You could say like, oh, this is the least electable person. But like with a less educated or less like literate sort of literate in the sense of like read, not literally can't read, but they don't read. You can't even make that argument because they'll just think, oh, Trump has the biggest rallies. Everyone loves Trump, or everyone loves this guy. Everyone, and so they don't learn from history. So this is the difficult part. I think this can be taken over. I think there needs to be a synthesis. I think that a lot of the never Trump types, the Jeb Bush and like that crowd. I had a conversation with Tim Miller not that long ago, and he's in these circles. I think those people are like they can't do this synthesis. All they can do is rage against Trumpism because they don't have the same sympathies. Like they don't have any of the grievances that the Trump people have. Someone like me, I mean, I share some of the grievances with like, the populists and the right wingers have. And so like somebody who shares those grievances, but at the same time sort of sees what the problem is with MAGA and sort of populism run amok. I think that's got to be the person who can synthesize. But it's got to, but again, it's got to happen after Trump because like if Trump wasn't here, like DeSantis would just be sailing to the nomination. People would say, "Oh, this is a reasonable politician." He might not even have to go so far, right? He might be able to be like more electable, and it might actually work. But it's hard just when Trump is there and just the force that can't be moved.
Yeah, it is too bad that Elon is not a U.S. citizen because it would be fascinating if he ran.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. Yeah, I don't know if he, I don't know if he would, but it would be interesting. Yeah, we should try to draft. We should try to draft that. We should try to do a tech guy, a governor in each state. We should just like seed them around the country and then see what can happen.
Do you think actually, like in the next 12 years, Vivek has a chance of making it? Like, if you had to predict what is Vivek's path, what would you expect?
A lot of Vivek specific questions. Look, the idea of any individual becoming a president is a long shot, right? And so the odds of me or you or Vivek or anyone else becoming president is just very, very long. I think he has a future in Republican politics, though. I think he can run, the OFC, if there's a Republican president, he can run, the OFCCP and the Department of Labor. He can be a high-ranking official. I think he could I think he could run for office. But I think he could do well. So yeah, I think Vivek is I'm bullish on Vivek, president. He's going for the full thing, the whole thing, like, very early on. But I think like regardless of how that ends up, he has a good future.
I want to ask you about other esteemed right wing thinkers. First, Bronze Age pervert. I'm curious because in some ways there's like some similarities in terms of secular rightism, an interest in Nietzsche, roots in 2015. How do you sort of characterize the Bronze Age pervert phenomenon?
So I have a Bronze Age pervert take that I think I've shared with you, and that I think I'm gonna save for now. I'm wondering if I should write this up, but I will say generally, I do appreciate a good Nietzschean. I don't think we have enough of that in our society. I think everyone's trying to be an egalitarian, and even like the people who think they're anti-egalitarian are really egalitarians in their world way. They just have a different tribe. He's a hilarious writer. I mean, his book is very funny. It's entertaining. Yeah, I think that and he understands. I think he sees sort of the problems with a lot of the populism too. I think he sees the problems with the pro-life stuff and with the sort of the left-wing economic stuff, or trying to explain, particularly bad is trying to explain cultural things in terms of conspiracy of capitalists or whatever. So yeah, Bap is an entertaining enough figure.
What would you say are kind of your biggest disagreements with the, let's say, like Tyler Cowens or Brian Kaplan's? Is it that they are, not willing to go far enough on are they egalitarians at heart, or like, where would you say the big disagreements?
They're probably, I mean, closer to me politically than most other people. I think, well, Brad Kaplan, I mean, this is not like tied to anything else, but Brad Kaplan doesn't believe in animal rights. Well, I do. I don't know if Tyler believes in animal rights or not, but I think, more humane approach to animals is probably correct. But I'm sort of, this is not an issue that a lot of people talk about. Tyler's worldview is generally, pro progress. I think I moved more towards him on foreign affairs and international issues. I probably doesn't don't go as far as he does. I think he probably thinks that that he really. I think I see him as like sort of more of a supporter of American foreign policy. I think he's more hawkish on China than I am. I think there's a way. Actually, that's a good one because I did talk to Tyler a little bit about this in Emergent Ventures, and I was telling him that basically I think that after the end of the Cold War that the U.S. and Boris Yeltsin, Clinton, I was reading a book called by Mary Surratt called Not One Inch, and I think there was a missed opportunity where like we could have really had peace with the Russians. We could have really like moved towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. My understanding is that they were ready to do this, and the U.S. just wasn't having it. The U.S. had the power at the time and was going to keep pushing forward. And I think there could be understanding reach with China. I think we could have a positive influence. Like it's like the right and the left. Like we say, oh, the right influences the left. We influence China, and China influences. Well, China probably doesn't influence us that much. We probably influence China more than they influence us. We're the cultural, we're the real cultural superpower, and we're the one in their backyard. Well, they're not in our backyard. Although we imagine, China has all this influence in the U.S., which I just don't believe. And so, yeah, I think there's on the AI stuff. I think there's like I don't know how worried to be about it, but like, the fact that I don't know means like we should be at least taking some precautions. And I think there could be sort of if we were able to sort of work with the Chinese here, I think we could do something. And I think like, a lot of, I think the Chinese just want to stay in power. And I think probably a lot of their bad, their bad instincts and their bad, behavior in the last few years is based on sort of America trying to build, a coalition to check their power. So yeah, I think I'm more of maybe a liberal internationalist than Tyler is.
Lastly, how about Scott Alexander?
Scott Alexander is funny because like I don't know if he calls himself a liberal or other people call himself a liberal, but like I agree with like everything he writes. I think that he's more, there's an instinctual thing. Like I think he's like comfortable with like hanging out with people who are polyamorous. And I'm not like a big prude, but yeah, no, the polyamory thing I don't tend to like. And the trans stuff, I mean, I think he's much more comfortable with that. But I'm not like I'm not like a big like policy person. Like I want to, yeah. I mean, in some ways, I'm like a traditional conservative. Like I think probably if you told Scott Alexander what Rufo was doing, I don't know what he'd think. He'd probably just say, I don't think that's the greatest, thing in the world. I don't think he'd be like so up and down, like against it completely. Or maybe he would. I don't know. I guess our interests are probably in different places. Like I'm interested in sort of the day to day of American politics. Yeah, it's hard to say. Scott Alexander, I'm very congenial towards. I think it's easier to disagree with like a politician or something than it is somebody like Scott Alexander, because Scott Alexander is just like a unique and interesting figure, and we sort of focus on different things to a large extent. And a lot of the different one, when you say what are your differences with him, most things that come to mind tend to be more just like, oh, this is a thing I've thought about a lot, but he's not thought about a lot. So it's like, it's gonna make sense that we differ.
It's interesting. You reviewed Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge. You talked about sort of, I guess, the attack vectors within, I think you called it white male liberalism. And it's interesting because Jonathan Rauch wrote a really great book called Kindly Inquisitors in like 1992. And that was the book that got me really excited about like classical liberalism. But seeing that he like is unable, it's unable to defend itself. It's almost like what is a liberalism that can actually defend itself? I guess it's one that is more on the side of liberty than equality or equity.
But Rauch does this very so it's a very annoying thing that I write in my review, is that like he acknowledges that like, oh, it's bad that like institutions like didn't have a lot of women and minorities. Like, okay, like then those is like if Western institutions are so great, but white men can't build great institutions, and like, yeah, we should change those institutions because like you just told us that like diversity in institutions and building them is like very important. So like, what is this argument? Oh, it's just a coincidence. The white men built everything that I happen to like, but don't pay attention to that. And now we're going to include women and different kinds of people, and nothing's going to change. I just don't think that's realistic.
Gearing towards closing here, you mentioned that in one of your posts how liberals read more and conservatives watch more TV. At the same time, you are a big TV aficionado yourself. So I'm curious if you could recommend one TV show to liberals, what would it be? And one book to conservatives, what would it be?
A TV show to liberals. I mean, I think that all like liberals like these prestige TV shows, and I always see that there's much more of a sort of conservative message that that liberals I would think would be comfortable with, but then liberals often will end up liking the same shows, and that's very interesting. Michelle Goldberg had an article in the New York Times about Succession. And people are going to watch this, are going to watch this or listen to this later. We're, I think 3 or 4 episodes into Succession. I won't give any spoilers, but her take on Succession was like almost the exact opposite of mine. But we both really like the show. I think that I think people should probably, if they want to understand conservative, they should probably like watch Tucker and Hannity and sort of get I think like watch like a full, like both of them like together, just to get like these two sort of sides of conservatism. They're not the two sides, they're not the only aspects, but they're like two sort of distinct branches of like sort of what conservatism is right now. It's a generational thing. It's an online versus TV thing. I do think if you haven't watched Succession, I think you should, because I think it's sort of a test of sort of your politics and how you see it. I think everyone who's really into politics ends up liking it, but it seems to me that they like it for sort of different reasons. And then, a book for, conservatives, I think it depends on, sort of what they're interested in. I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. I think Zarathustra's a great book, even though I'm not a big philosophy guy. I do like Zarathustra. I think the Hayek's Road to Serfdom. I still think, the ideas about central planning. I used to think this stuff was very basic, and like why the price system is important, and why central planning doesn't work. I grew up sort of reading that stuff because libertarianism was a big thing, but apparently I think kids have like lost that. So like you need to understand like why all the things you believe in now like still don't work. Like there hasn't been any great new conceptual breakthrough that makes tariffs a good thing, or industrial policy a good thing. I think that that's probably still worth checking out for people who haven't. And then of course my book and Origins of Woke will be out in September, and people should read all my articles on wokeness as preparation, and then read that when that comes out.
Yeah, we'll put them in the show notes. It is interesting. Some people think if you're super pro AI, some people think that actually the price problem might be fixed by a centralized sort of algorithm that will be able
Oh,
to
you'll finally be smart enough to do central planning. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, not the first time that claim's been made.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe last question, any commentary on like Silicon Valley intellectual culture? Like a lot of people listening to this might be, entrepreneurs or investors who are kind of politics curious, but it's not their main thing. And you have a little bit of a sense for what Silicon Valley has been, or tech in general has been exposed to intellectually. Any commentary on that?
Yeah, I think that if they are interested in politics, I think this goes back to sort of what we've been talking about with ideas versus sort of processes, and sort of my, theories about how the world and how policy changes. I think you have to get directly, like, don't think that like you're just gonna like have a very high level thing. You're gonna have some great art, and that's gonna like change people's minds, and that's gonna change the culture. Like, maybe like in the very long run, but the most direct path to power is power. I mean, and often, and people think culture, people see the flow from culture to politics. They don't understand that so much of culture is also downstream of politics. These things interact together. So if you're interested in culture, do the cultural thing, right? If you're interested in politics, don't go this indirect route. Go the direct route, and then the culture will also be influenced, and you'll change the world in the way you are. So I think my work on wokeness, I think why it's had a big influence is because I'm not telling people something abstract. I'm telling people something, this is what happened, and this is exactly what you could do. But I'm spoon feeding them. I'm not leaving anything to sort of that can fall through the cracks, because if you think someone else is going to like pick up, it's probably, you see it in building companies or whatever. Like you think there's this great idea, and you think someone's just going to pick up the baton and do it, and then often it just doesn't happen. Like you have to do it yourself. Like no, like you have to sort of figure out the steps of like why this thing is important, why it's relevant, exactly what it can be done. And you can influence people in that way. And that means whether, you could be a writer, you could support a writer doing these things, or you could just go into the political activism directly and just focus on your issue. I would tell people to be more concrete here and think of it sort of more the way you would a business, rather than, these sort of abstract ideas about theory or culture is going to somehow change the world. It does, but like, it's much, much harder to do, and much, much more uncertain.
It's interesting. Maybe too many people took the Breitbart idea that culture is more important than politics.
Exactly. We took it way too far.
My guest today has been Richard Hanania. I highly recommend reading the book, or pre-ordering the book, and checking out Richard's Substack and Twitter. Richard, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks, Erik.
Upstream with Erik Torenberg is a show from Turpentine, the podcast network behind Moment of Zen and Cognitive Revolution. If you like the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store.